Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Nicole Evans, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the high Uinta wilderness of Utah, along the Highline Trail 3 summers ago. I've been an avid hiker for most of my adult life, but what I experienced in those mountains has kept me away from the wilderness ever since. My girlfriend, Melissa, and I had been dating for almost 2 years. She was an emergency room nurse with a calm demeanor that balanced my anxious tendencies perfectly. We'd planned this 5-day backpacking trip for months, our first real adventure together. Melissa had hiked parts of the Uintas before, but this would be my first time in Utah's most remote mountain range. It's otherworldly up there, she'd told me, eyes bright with excitement. The landscapes change like you're walking through different planets. You're going to love it. The high Uinta's wilderness spans over 456,000 acres of pristine alpine terrain. Its highest point, Kings Peak, rises to 13,834 feet, making it the tallest mountain in Utah. What attracted us most was the isolation. Miles of trails with few other hikers, especially if you ventured beyond the popular areas. We craved that solitude after months of working overtime in our cramped Seattle apartment during the pandemic. We arrived at the Highline Trailhead on a Tuesday morning in late July. The parking lot held only 3 other vehicles, a good sign for the seclusion we sought. As we shouldered our packs, I noticed an older man watching us from his dusty pickup truck. His weathered face creased into a frown as he rolled down his window. "You folks heading up to Naturalist Basin?" he called. Melissa nodded. "That's the plan. We'll be out for 5 days." The man's eyes narrowed. "Might want to reconsider. There's been trouble up there lately." "What kind of trouble?" I asked, feeling the first flutter of unease in my stomach. He hesitated. "People gone missing. Rangers found one fella last month, but he wasn't right in the head after. Kept talking about something following him." He shrugged. "Just watch yourselves. Don't split up." Melissa thanked him for the warning, but I could tell she was dismissing his concerns. She'd encountered plenty of locals who enjoyed scaring tourists with ominous tales. I wasn't so quick to brush it off, having always been more susceptible to suggestion. "He's probably just an old guy who likes spooking city folk," Melissa said as we set off down the trail. "Besides, bears and mountain lions are the only real predators up here, and they rarely bother humans." The first day was everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through stands of aspen and pine, meadows filled with wildflowers, and alongside crystal-clear streams. By late afternoon, we'd covered 8 miles and made camp near a small lake, where we swam in the icy water and dried ourselves on sun-warmed rocks. That night, exhausted from the hike and altitude adjustment, we fell asleep quickly in our tent. I woke sometime in the middle of the night, disoriented and unsure what had disturbed me. The air in the tent felt unnaturally cold, despite our quality sleeping bags. Outside, the forest was completely silent. No wind in the trees, no small nocturnal animals rustling in the underbrush. The absence of sound was more unsettling than any noise could have been. Nature is never truly quiet, especially at night. "Mel," I whispered, reaching across to shake her gently. "Are you awake?" No response. I fumbled for my headlamp and switched it on. Melissa's sleeping bag was empty. My heart lurched as I called her name, louder this time. Nothing. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my bare feet flinching against the cold ground. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the clearing around our campsite. "Melissa," I called, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Over here," came her reply from the direction of the lake. Relief flooded through me as I spotted her silhouette standing at the water's edge, her back to me. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, picking my way across the rocky ground toward her. She didn't turn around. "I heard someone calling my name." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crept up my spine. From where? From the water. I reached her side and found her staring fixedly at the lake's surface. The moonlight reflected off the still water, creating an almost perfect mirror of the night sky. Except for one dark spot near the center, a disturbance in the reflection, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. "Let's go back to the tent," I said, taking her arm. Her skin felt ice cold. She resisted slightly before allowing me to lead her away. Back in our sleeping bags, I asked if she remembered getting up. "I must have been sleepwalking," she murmured, already drifting off again. "Never done that before." I lay awake for a long time, listening to the silence that still blanketed the forest. Morning arrived with warm sunshine and birdsong that made the night's unease seem like a product of my imagination. Melissa had no recollection of her midnight wandering, laughing it off as altitude sickness. We packed up and continued along the Highline Trail toward Naturalist Basin. The second day of hiking took us higher into the mountains. The trail grew steeper, the air thinner. Wildflowers gave way to more rugged alpine vegetation, and the forest thinned as we approached the tree line. By mid-afternoon, we reached a spectacular overlook where the land fell away to reveal a panorama of jagged peaks and hidden valleys. "This is what I've been wanting to show you," Melissa said, her face glowing with exertion and excitement. She pointed to a distant bowl-shaped depression nestled between three peaks. "That's Naturalist Basin. We'll camp there tomorrow night." Between us and the basin lay a section of trail that traversed a barren slope of the loose rock and scree. As we picked our way carefully across this exposed stretch, I noticed dark clouds building rapidly over the mountains to the west. "We should hurry," I said, eyeing the approaching storm. "We need to find a campsite below the tree line." Melissa nodded, her earlier enthusiasm dampened by the threatening weather. We increased our pace, but the storm moved faster. Within 20 minutes, the temperature plummeted, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. Thunder rumbled ominously in the distance. We found shelter in a stand of gnarled pines just as the rain became a deluge. Hastily, we set up our tent and crawled inside, pulling our packs in after us. Outside, lightning flashed almost continuously, followed by deafening thunder that seemed to shake the mountain beneath us. "Some vacation, huh?" Melissa grinned, wringing water from her ponytail. "I'll take this over a crowded resort any day," I replied, though in truth, the ferocity of the storm was making me nervous. We were incredibly exposed up here, miles from any help if something went wrong. The storm raged for hours. We ate a cold dinner of trail mix and jerky, unable to use our camp stove in the tent. As darkness fell, the lightning provided the only illumination, casting eerie blue-white flashes through the tent fabric. During a brief lull in the thunder, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, seemingly right outside our tent, whispering Melissa's name. "Did you hear that?" I hissed. Melissa looked up from the book she was reading on her Kindle. "Hear what?" The whisper came again, closer this time, somehow audible over the pounding rain. "Melissa." Her face paled. That sounds like my mother." "Your mother? But that's impossible." I knew her mother had passed away when Melissa was in college over a decade ago. Another flash of lightning, and this time I saw a silhouette against the tent wall. A hunched, misshapen form that was unmistakably human, yet wrong somehow. The shadow raised what appeared to be an arm, fingers splayed like claws. Melissa screamed, scrambling backward. The figure outside moved, circling our tent with quick, jerky movements. The whispering continued, but now it was interspersed with clicking noises, like bones knocking together. "We need to get out of here," I said, fumbling for the tent zipper with shaking hands. "Are you crazy?" Melissa grabbed my wrist. "We don't know what's out there. We can't stay in this tent. It's not safe." I found my headlamp and switched it on, then unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. Rain lashed my face, nearly blinding me. The beam of my headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but rain-soaked trees swaying violently in the wind. I swung the light in a slow arc, searching for any sign of the figure we'd seen. "There's nothing," I said, relief and confusion mingling in my voice. "Maybe it was just shadows from the trees." Melissa shook her head, her face still ashen. "I know what I heard. That was my mother's voice." Another flash of lightning illuminated the clearing, and in that split second, I saw it. A pale, emaciated figure standing between two distant trees, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Then darkness returned, and it was gone. I slammed the tent zipper shut. "We need to leave. First light, we're heading back to the trailhead." Melissa nodded, too frightened to argue. Neither of us slept that night. We sat back to back in the center of the tent, headlamps on, listening to the storm and the occasional whispers that still came from the darkness outside. When dawn finally arrived, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by mist and fallen branches. We packed quickly, speaking little. Our previous day's jubilation had been replaced by a single-minded determination to get off the mountain as quickly as possible. As we shouldered our packs, Melissa paused, staring at something on the ground near where we'd seen the figure during the night. "Nicole!" she called, her voice tight with fear. "Look at this!" I joined her and felt my stomach lurch. There, pressed into the mud, was a set of footprints unlike any I'd ever seen. They were roughly human in shape but elongated and deep, as if whatever had made them carried great weight despite its skeletal appearance. Most disturbing of all, they appeared to have been made by bare feet. "Let's go," I said, taking Melissa's hand. "Now." We set off down the trail we'd climbed the previous day, moving as quickly as the wet, slippery conditions would allow. The mist clung to the mountainside, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet in places. Sounds were muffled, creating the unsettling impression that we were walking through a world separate from reality. Around mid-morning, we reached the scree slope we'd crossed the day before. In good conditions, it was challenging but manageable. Now, saturated from the storm and shrouded in mist, it looked treacherous. "We have to cross," Melissa said, eyeing the expanse of unstable rock. "There's no other way down." I nodded, though every instinct was screaming at me to find another route. "You go first. I'll follow in your footsteps." Melissa stepped onto the scree, testing each placement before committing her weight. We made slow progress, the loose rock shifting unpredictably beneath our feet. About halfway across, the mist briefly thinned, revealing the dizzying drop below us. That was when we heard it. A terrible keening cry that echoed off the mountainsides, seemingly coming from everywhere at once. The sound was neither animal nor human, but something in between, filled with hunger and malice. "Move faster," I urged, fighting rising panic. Melissa increased her pace, but in her haste, she stepped on an unstable section of scree. The rocks gave way beneath her, and she fell, sliding several feet before managing to stop herself. I heard her cry out in pain. "I'm coming," I called, picking my way toward her as quickly as I dared. When I reached her side, I saw blood soaking through her hiking pants at the knee. "I hit a sharp rock," she grimaced, pulling up the torn fabric to reveal a deep gash. I quickly retrieved our first aid kit and cleaned and bandaged the wound as best I could, but it was clear she wouldn't be moving quickly on it. "Can you walk?" I asked, helping her to her feet. She tested her weight on the injured leg and nodded. "It hurts, but I can manage. We don't have much choice, do we?" We continued across the scree with agonizing slowness, Melissa leaning heavily on my shoulder. The keening cry came twice more, closer each time. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hunting us, using the mist as cover. By the time we reached the relative safety of the trail on the other side, it was early afternoon. Melissa's face was pale from pain and blood loss, and our progress had slowed to a crawl. At this rate, we wouldn't reach the trailhead until well after dark. "We need to find a place to camp," I said reluctantly. "You need to rest that leg, and I don't want to be on this mountain after sunset. We found a small clearing beside the trail, more exposed than I would have liked, but with good visibility in all directions. I set up the tent while Melissa sat with her injured leg elevated, keeping watch. Neither of us spoke of what might be following us, but the fear hung between us, heavier than the mist. As I secured the last tent stake, Melissa suddenly grabbed my arm. "Listen," she whispered. At first, I heard nothing. Then it came to me, a soft, rhythmic sound like footsteps approaching on the trail. I stood, peering into the mist, and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. "Maybe it's another hiker," Melissa suggested, though her tone conveyed her doubt. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "We could use some help. My friend is injured." For several long seconds, there was complete silence. Then the mist ahead of us seemed to thicken and darken, coalescing into a vaguely human shape. It was still distant, perhaps 50 yards away, but I could make out impossibly long limbs and a head that sat awkwardly on narrow shoulders. "Get in the tent," I said, my voice a harsh whisper. "Now." Melissa didn't argue. I helped her inside, then followed, zipping the tent closed behind us. We huddled together, watching the tent walls for any sign of movement outside. "What is that thing?" Melissa asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted. "But the old man at the trailhead tried to warn us. He said people had gone missing up here." The footsteps resumed, closer now, circling our tent just as they had the night before. With them came the whispering, Melissa's name, called in her dead mother's voice. "Melissa, come to me, sweetheart. I've missed you so much." Melissa pressed her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. "It's not her," she kept repeating. "It's not her." I held her tightly, my mind racing for a plan. We couldn't outrun this thing, not with Melissa injured. We couldn't fight it. I sensed on some primal level that whatever stalked us was far stronger than it appeared. Our only hope was to survive until morning and pray that sunlight would drive it away. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped dramatically. Our breath fogged in the air inside the tent. The whispering continued, sometimes retreating as if losing interest, only to return with renewed intensity. Around midnight, the thing changed tactics. Instead of Melissa's mother's voice, it began to mimic my voice, calling to Melissa. "Mel, I need your help out here. Something's wrong with the food bags." Melissa's eyes widened in terror as she looked at me, then at the tent flap where the voice had come from. "Don't listen," I whispered. "I'm right here. That's not me." The imitation was uncanny. Not just my voice, but my speech patterns. The little nickname I used for her. Everything perfect. It was as if the creature had been studying us, learning how to manipulate us. When its deception failed, the thing became enraged. It screamed, a sound of such pure hatred and frustration that it seemed to physically strike us. Then it began to press against the tent, creating bulges in the fabric as if testing for weaknesses. I grabbed my hunting knife from my pack, a last resort I hoped I wouldn't need to use. Melissa clutched her trekking poles, the only potential weapons we had. The pressure against the tent suddenly ceased. For several minutes there was no sound at all. Then something heavy landed on the roof of the tent, nearly collapsing it on top of us. Long, bony fingers began to tear at the fabric. "Run!" I shouted, slashing at the probing fingers with my knife. I heard an inhuman shriek of pain, and the pressure briefly lifted. I unzipped the tent and pushed Melissa out. "Go! Follow the trail down." She stumbled into the darkness, her headlamp bobbing as she limped away. I grabbed our most essential gear, water, first aid kit, headlamps, and followed, not daring to look back at whatever was emerging from the rent in our tent. We fled downhill, heedless of the treacherous trail. Melissa fell twice, reopening her wound, but adrenaline kept her moving. Behind us, that keening cry echoed through the forest, spurring us to greater speed. After what felt like hours of desperate flight, we came upon something unexpected, the warm glow of a campfire through the trees. Without hesitation, we changed course toward it. "Help!" I called as we approached. "Please, we need help." A man stepped into view, silhouetted against the fire. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn hiking clothes with a full beard and watchful eyes. Behind him, I could see a simple camp, a one-person tent, a small fire ring, minimal gear. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice calm but wary. "Something's chasing us," Melissa gasped, collapsing to the ground, her injured leg finally giving out. "Something not natural." The man's expression changed from suspicion to grim understanding. "The Wendigo," he said softly. "The what?" I asked, helping Melissa closer to the fire's warmth. "Wendigo. It's what the Ute people called it. Been haunting these mountains for centuries." He introduced himself as Daniel Roberts, a wildlife biologist studying alpine ecosystems. He'd been in the Uintas for 3 weeks on this trip, and it wasn't his first encounter with the entity. "It preys on the desperate and isolated," Daniel explained as he examined Melissa's wound. "Mimics voices, creates illusions. The Ute believed it was once human, transformed by greed and cannibalism into something monstrous." "How do we stop it?" I asked. Daniel's gaze flicked to the darkness beyond the firelight. "You don't. You survive it. Fire helps. They fear it. And they rarely attack groups larger than 2. That's why I offered to guide those other hikers down last week." My heart sank. "So, we're stuck here? We can't go back to the trailhead?" "Not tonight," he said firmly. "Your friend needs rest, and the Wendigo is strongest in the dark. We'll leave at first light, all 3 of us. Safety in numbers." We huddled around the fire, taking turns keeping watch while the others tried to rest. Daniel shared his spare clothes and food with us since we'd lost most of our gear in our flight. Throughout the night, we heard the creature moving in the forest around us, but it never approached the firelight directly. Daniel told us more about the legends, how Wendigos were insatiably hungry, how they grew in proportion to their last meal, how they could hibernate for years between feedings. Most disturbing was his theory that they could infect others with their nature through prolonged contact, slowly turning victims into creatures like themselves. "That's why people go missing up here and are never found," he explained, "or why they come back changed." I thought of the old man's warning at the trailhead about someone being found, but not right in the head afterward. As dawn approached, the sounds of the creature grew fainter until we could no longer detect its presence. Daniel stirred the fire one last time, then began packing his gear. "We should move quickly," he advised. "It will retreat to whatever den it uses during daylight. But we're still in its territory." With Daniel carrying most of our remaining gear and me supporting Melissa, we set off down the trail. The morning was clear, the mist of the previous day burned away by bright sunshine. Under different circumstances, it would have been a beautiful hike. Daniel proved to be an excellent guide, knowing shortcuts and easier paths that weren't marked on standard maps. By mid-afternoon, we could see the parking lot where Melissa and I had left our car just 3 days earlier, though it felt like weeks had passed. As we approached the trailhead, Daniel grew increasingly quiet and tense. I attributed it to vigilance, keeping watch for the Wendigo until I noticed him studying Melissa with an odd intensity. "Is something wrong?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "When did she cut her leg? Exactly." "Yesterday morning, on the scree slope." "Why?" Daniel nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "And when did you first hear the voice calling her name? Before or after the injury?" A chill ran through me as I realized what he was suggesting. "Before. The night of the storm." "Then she's not infected," he said, his relief palpable. "The Wendigo marks its victims before it takes them, usually with a voice they trust, a parent, a spouse. It creates a connection, then follows it like a beacon." "It called my mother's name," Melissa said, her voice hollow. "My dead mother." Daniel nodded grimly. "It feeds on grief and fear as much as flesh. More, sometimes." We reached the parking lot and I unlocked our car with hands that still trembled slightly. Daniel helped me get Melissa settled in the passenger seat, then stepped back. "You should get her to a hospital," he said. "That leg needs proper attention." "You're not coming with us?" I asked, surprised. "We can drop you wherever you need to go." He shook his head. "My work here isn't finished. There are other hikers in those mountains who might need warning." I wanted to argue, to insist he come with us to safety, but something in his expression stopped me. There was a haunted quality to his eyes that suggested he had his own reasons for remaining in the wilderness. "Thank you," I said instead, pressing my contact information into his hand. "If you ever need anything—" He smiled faintly. "Just tell people to be careful up there. Some places aren't meant for us." As we drove away, I watched him in the rearview mirror, standing motionless at the edge of the forest. Just before we rounded a bend in the road, I could have sworn I saw a second figure emerge from the trees behind him, tall and gaunt, with limbs too long for its body. Melissa recovered from her physical injuries within weeks. The psychological wounds took longer to heal. For months after our return, she would wake screaming from nightmares where her mother called her name. I fared little better, jumping at shadows and refusing to go anywhere near forests after dark. We tried to research Daniel Roberts when we got home, curious about the biologist who had saved our lives. What we found chilled us to the bone. There was no wildlife biologist by that name working in the Uintas or anywhere in Utah. The only Daniel Roberts connected to the area had been a hiker who disappeared in those mountains in 2017, whose body was never recovered. I've spent countless hours since then wondering who or what guided us safely off that mountain. Was it possible that Daniel had survived his encounter with the Wendigo years ago, choosing to remain in the wilderness as some kind of guardian? Or was there something more inexplicable at work? Melissa and I broke up 6 months after the incident. The shared trauma had created a bond between us, but also a constant reminder of what we'd experienced. Sometimes I wonder if she's still haunted by her mother's voice, still glancing over her shoulder at unexpected sounds. As for me, I've moved to San Diego, as far from the mountains of Utah as I could reasonably get. I tell myself I'm safe here, surrounded by city lights and people. But sometimes, when the marine fog rolls in thick and white, I hear footsteps outside my window and a voice that sounds almost, but not quite, human, whispering my name. And I wonder if the hunger of the Wendigo can ever truly be escaped, or if once it knows your name, it will follow you forever. My name is Angela Roberts, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the high Uinta's wilderness of Utah just last summer, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day backpacking trip to celebrate finishing my master's degree. I'd always been the outdoor type, finding peace in the vast wilderness where cell signals died and the only sounds were those nature intended. The Uintas called to me with their alpine lakes and dense forests, a perfect escape from 2 grueling years of academic pressure. My golden retriever, Rusty, needed the adventure as much as I did. He'd been patient through countless nights of me hunched over textbooks, his soulful eyes watching as I ignored his tennis ball for another paragraph on environmental policy. I chose Mirror Lake as my destination, a popular spot but one that would still offer solitude if you knew where to look. My plan was to hike beyond the day trippers to find a secluded camping spot near one of the smaller, unnamed lakes that dotted the wilderness area. The ranger at the station gave me a curious look when I mentioned going alone. "Not many solo female hikers this time of year," he said, stamping my permit. "Weather's been strange. Locals say the mountains have been restless." I laughed it off. "Rusty's all the protection I need," I said, rubbing my dog's ears as he leaned against my leg. The ranger didn't smile back. "Just stay on the marked trails. Some folks went off path last month. Search and rescue found their gear, but not them." I nodded politely, but internally rolled my eyes. I'd been hiking these mountains since I was a kid. The warnings were always the same. Don't go off trail. Tell someone your route. Carry enough water. Basic stuff any experienced hiker knows. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. The June air was crisp with the scent of pine, and patches of snow still clung to the north-facing slopes. Rusty bounded ahead, occasionally returning with a stick or to check that I was still following. By late afternoon, we'd reached a perfect camping spot, a small clearing near a lake so clear it reflected the surrounding peaks like glass. I set up my tent, hung my food from a branch to keep it away from wildlife, and built a small fire. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, I sat with my back against a log. Rusty's warm body pressed against my side. The stars emerged, impossibly bright against the ink-black sky. I felt the tension of the past years sliding off my shoulders. I didn't notice anything strange until the fire started to dim. The flames, which had been a healthy orange, suddenly took on a greenish tint. I blinked, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, the fire appeared normal. Rusty seemed unbothered, snoring gently at my feet. Then came the sound. At first, I thought it was the wind through the trees, a low, mournful whistle. But the air was still, the pine needles motionless. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Not wind, but something like singing. A woman's voice, distant but clear, weaving a melody without words. Rusty's head snapped up, ears perked. He stood, hackles raised, staring into the darkness beyond the fire's light. "Hello," I called, reaching for my headlamp. "Is someone there?" The singing stopped. Rusty growled, a deep rumble in his chest I'd never heard before. "It's okay, boy," I said, but my voice sounded thin in the sudden silence. I swept my light across the trees, revealing nothing but shadows and swaying branches. Rusty wouldn't settle, pacing the edge of our camp, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. I decided it must have been another camper, though I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. Perhaps sound carried strangely over the water. I climbed into my tent, coaxing Rusty inside with me. He usually slept at my feet, but that night he positioned himself between me and the tent door, alert and watchful. I woke to absolute silence. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but a smothering absence of sound. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. The tent was bathed in gray dawn light, and Rusty was gone. Panic gripped me as I scrambled out of the sleeping bag. The tent door was still zipped closed, exactly as I'd left it. But Rusty, a 70-pound dog, had somehow vanished without disturbing it. I called his name, my voice echoing across the lake. No answering bark, no crashing through underbrush, no wet nose pushing into my hand. My campsite looked wrong. The fire pit, which I'd carefully extinguished the night before, was now a black smear of ash spreading nearly 6 feet in diameter. My backpack, which I'd left leaning against a tree, was now hanging from a branch, higher than I could have possibly reached. And there were footprints. Small, barefoot impressions in the soft dirt around my tent. They approached from the forest, circled my tent multiple times, then led back to the tree line. I followed them to the edge of the clearing where they simply stopped, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had vanished into thin air. "Rusty!" I called again, my voice cracking. A bird finally broke the silence, its call distorted and strange, like a recording played at half speed. I had to find my dog. I grabbed my day pack, filled it with water and snacks, and started following the shoreline of the lake, calling Rusty's name every few steps. The morning mist hung heavy over the water, reducing visibility to just a few yards ahead. My voice seemed to die in the fog, swallowed by the unnatural silence. An hour into my search, I heard splashing. I ran toward the sound, hope surging in my chest. Through the mist, I could make out a golden shape in the shallows of the lake. "Rusty, come here, boy." The figure turned, and my relief curdled into dread. It had the shape and color of my dog, but its movements were wrong, jerky and stiff, like a marionette controlled by inexperienced hands. As it came closer, I could see that its eyes were black, entirely black, without the warm brown I knew so well. It wasn't Rusty. It couldn't be. But it wore his collar, had his distinctive white patch on the chest. The thing that looked like my dog stopped at the water's edge, its head tilting at an impossible angle. "Who are you?" I whispered, backing away. The not Rusty opened its mouth, but instead of a bark, that same haunting melody I'd heard the night before emerged, a woman's voice coming from my dog's throat. Then it smiled, showing teeth that were too long, too numerous. I ran. Blind panic propelled me back toward my campsite, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me. I burst into the clearing, grabbing my tent and stuffing it haphazardly into my pack, abandoning anything non-essential. I had to get back to civilization, to people, to normalcy. The trail back to the ranger station was 8 miles. I could make it by afternoon if I hurried. I started down the path, my breath coming in ragged gasps, constantly looking over my shoulder for any sign of the thing wearing my dog's skin. The forest felt wrong. Trees I didn't remember passing on the way in loomed over the trail. The sun, which should have been climbing in the east, seemed to hover directly overhead, casting no shadows. My watch read 8:17 a.m., but the quality of light suggested noon. 2 hours of hard hiking should have covered significant ground, but when I spotted a familiar rock formation, I realized with sinking horror that I was less than a mile from my campsite. Somehow, the trail had curved back on itself without my noticing. I checked my compass. The needle spun lazily, refusing to settle on north. My phone, which I'd brought for its GPS capability, showed no signal and the battery had drained completely despite being fully charged the previous evening. I was lost. I forced myself to stop, to think rationally. The ranger station was east. The sun, regardless of its strange position, could still give me a general sense of direction. I'd follow the drainage downhill. Water always led to civilization eventually. As I plotted my new course, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, half expecting to see the not Rusty. Instead, a woman stood on the trail. She was small, almost childlike, with long gray hair that hung limply around a face lined with so many wrinkles it was difficult to make out her features. She wore a faded floral dress, incongruous in the wilderness, and her feet were bare despite the rocky terrain. "Are you lost, dear?" Her voice was thin, reedy, but somehow familiar. Relief flooded through me. Another person, however strange, meant help. "Yes, I'm trying to get back to the trailhead, but I seem to be going in circles." She smiled, revealing teeth stained brown. "The forest does that sometimes. Keeps what it wants." She stepped closer. "You're looking for your dog, aren't you?" Ice slid down my spine. "How did you know about my dog?" "He found me this morning, golden thing with kind eyes. I told him I'd help find his mistress." She extended a hand. Her fingers were too long, the nails curved and yellow. "I'm Hester. I lived not far from here. Your dog is waiting at my cabin." Every instinct screamed danger, but the thought of Rusty, my Rusty, not the thing by the lake, kept me rooted to the spot. "My dog's eyes are brown," I said cautiously. Hester's smile widened. "Oh yes, lovely brown eyes, so trusting." "How far is your cabin?" "Not far, dear, just through the hollow." I didn't know what hollow she meant, but I did know I wasn't following this strange woman anywhere. "Actually, I think I'll continue on the trail. If you could just point me toward the ranger station. There's no trail that will take you there now." Her voice had changed, deeper, resonating in my chest. "The forest has shifted. It does that when it hungers." I backed away, reaching for my trekking pole. A poor weapon, but better than nothing. "I need to go." Hester's face contorted, the wrinkles deepening until her features seemed to collapse inward. "He's waiting for you. In pieces." I ran again, veering off the trail and crashing through underbrush. I didn't care about direction now, only distance from the woman with the collapsing face. Branches tore at my clothes, rocks turned under my boots, threatening to sprain an ankle. The trees thinned suddenly, revealing a depression in the land, a hollow filled with mist despite the midday sun. Somehow, in my panicked flight, I'd run exactly where Hester wanted me to go. The hollow was perfectly circular, perhaps 100 yards across, ringed by ancient pines that leaned inward like spectators around a fighting pit. At its center stood a cabin, if it could be called that, a ramshackle structure of raw timber and stone that seemed to have grown out of the earth rather than been built upon it. And on the cabin's porch, sitting alert and whole, was Rusty. "Rusty," I called, joy and suspicion warring within me. The dog's tail wagged, his posture relaxed and natural. When he barked, it was his voice, not that awful singing. I wanted desperately to believe it was really him, but the cabin behind him radiated wrongness. Smoke curled from a crooked chimney, green-tinged like my campfire had been. The windows were dark, but I sensed movement behind them, shapes shifting just beyond my perception. Rusty barked again, apparently unafraid. He'd always been a good judge of character, able to sense dangerous people long before I could. If he was comfortable here... I took a hesitant step into the hollow, then another. The mist swirled around my ankles, cold and damp. Rusty bounded down the porch steps, racing toward me with his familiar loping gait. When he reached me, I knelt, checking him over with trembling hands. His eyes were normal, his familiar warm brown. His wet nose pushed against my cheek as he whined softly, tail wagging so hard his entire body shook. This was my dog, my Rusty. "What happened, boy?" I whispered, holding his face between my hands. "Where did you go?" "He was looking for her," said a man's voice, deep and melodic. I looked up. A tall figure stood on the cabin porch, silhouetted against the green smoke. As he descended the steps, his features became clearer, handsome in a severe way, with high cheekbones and eyes so dark they appeared black in the dim light of the hollow. He wore simple clothes, a flannel shirt and jeans that would have looked at home on any hiker, but they seemed wrong on him, as if he were wearing a costume. "Hester's been expecting you," he said, stopping several yards away. "I'm Jacob. I help her. Tend to visitors." Rusty growled, backing against my legs. His earlier comfort had evaporated. I stood slowly, keeping one hand on Rusty's collar. "I'm just trying to find my way back to the trailhead." Jacob smiled, showing too many teeth. "No one finds their way out of the hollow without Hester's blessing. She's the keeper here." "Keeper of what?" "The balance," he said, as if that explained everything. "For every life the mountains give, they must take one in return." "I don't understand." "The couple that was lost last month," Jacob said, pacing slowly to my left, forcing me to turn to keep him in sight. "The mountains gave them to Hester, but 2 were taken, so 2 must be given back." Cold understanding dawned. "You've been following me since I entered the wilderness." "We've been watching you since you spoke to the ranger," Jacob corrected. "Hester chose you the moment you mentioned coming alone. Just you and your dog, 1 human, 1 animal. Perfect balance for what was taken." From behind me, Hester's reedy voice called, "Don't play with her, Jacob. Bring her inside. The sun is high. It's time." I backed away, pulling Rusty with me. We were still near the edge of the hollow, if we could make it back to the trees. Jacob moved with unnatural speed, circling behind us, cutting off our escape. "The hard way, then," he sighed, reaching into his pocket. What happened next unfolded in heartbeats. Rusty, loyal to the end, launched himself at Jacob, jaws snapping. Jacob produced a curved knife, its blade glinting green in the strange light. I screamed, lunging forward to pull Rusty away, but I was too slow. The knife descended. Rusty yelped, a sound that will haunt my nightmares forever. Blood matted his golden fur, and he crumpled to the ground, still snarling weakly. Rage replaced fear. I grabbed my trekking pole with both hands and swung it like a baseball bat, catching Jacob across the temple. He staggered back, more surprised than hurt. I swung again, connecting with his wrist. The knife fell to the ground. I should have run then, but I couldn't leave Rusty. I knelt beside him, hands pressing against the wound in his side, trying to staunch the bleeding. His breathing was labored, his eyes fixed on mine. "Don't you die," I whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare." A shadow fell over us. Hester stood there, her face now so collapsed it barely resembled a human visage. "The balance must be maintained," she hissed. "If not the dog, then you." Something changed in Rusty's eyes. A spark. A determination I'd never seen before. With a strength that seemed impossible given his injury, he lunged past me, directly at Hester's legs. His teeth sank into her calf, and she shrieked. A sound no human throat could make, high and piercing like metal scraping metal. I scooped up Jacob's knife and slashed at Hester's reaching hands. The blade cut deep, but what welled from the wound wasn't blood. It was black and viscous, with that same green tinge as the smoke and fire. Hester's shriek became the singing I'd heard by the lake, but distorted now, painful to hear. The sound seemed to shake the very air, making the trees around the hollow bend and sway. The ground trembled beneath my feet. Jacob was recovering, pushing himself up from where he'd fallen. I slashed at him too, catching his cheek. The same black substance oozed from the cut. "Run!" I screamed at Rusty, but he wouldn't leave my side, wounded as he was. The hollow was disintegrating around us. The mist rose from the ground in tendrils, wrapping around Hester and Jacob like loving arms. The cabin's walls rippled as if made of water rather than wood. Reality itself seemed to be coming apart at the seams. I grabbed Rusty, hefting all 70 pounds of him into my arms, ignoring his yelp of pain and my own screaming muscles. I ran for the trees, even as the ground buckled and heaved beneath me. Behind us, Hester's singing rose to a crescendo that felt like needles in my brain. We broke through the tree line just as a sound like thunder cracked across the sky. I risked a glance back. Where the hollow had been was now just forest. Continuous, unbroken pine trees with no sign of a depression or a cabin, no sign of Hester or Jacob. But the danger wasn't over. The mountain itself seemed angry, the ground still shaking. A massive cracking sound split the air as a tree fell just yards from where we stood. I kept running, blindly, Rusty growing heavier in my arms with each step. I don't know how long I ran or in what direction. Time slipped and stretched. The sun, which had been directly overhead in the hollow, was now setting in the west where it belonged. My watch, which had read 8:17 a.m. for hours, now showed 7:45 p.m. When I finally stopped, unable to carry Rusty any farther, I found myself on a dirt fire road. In the distance, I could see the lights of vehicles. I collapsed to my knees, gently laying Rusty down. His breathing was shallow, the blood from his wound now dried and crusted, but his eyes were alert, watching me with complete trust. "Help!" I screamed toward the lights. "Please, help us!" The lights changed direction, heading toward us. Minutes later, a Forest Service truck pulled up and 2 rangers jumped out, faces concerned. "What happened?" one asked, kneeling beside Rusty. I couldn't tell them the truth. Who would believe me? "Bear attack," I gasped. "My dog. He saved me. Please, he needs a vet." They loaded us into the truck, radioing ahead for emergency services. As we drove down the mountain, one ranger explained that they'd been searching for me since that morning. "The ranger at the station got worried when your car was still there past your return date," he said. "Said something felt off about the mountains. We've been combing the area all day." My permit had been for 3 days. I was sure I'd only been in the wilderness for 2 nights and a day, but according to the rangers, I'd been missing for 5 days. Rusty survived his injury, though he now walks with a slight limp. The vet said the wound was strange, not consistent with a bear attack. "Almost ritualistic," she'd murmured, before seeing my expression and quickly changing the subject. "We never hiked the high Uintas again, but the mountains aren't done with us. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear singing outside my window, a woman's voice, wordless and mournful. And Rusty's hackles rise, a growl rumbling in his chest as he stares into the darkness, seeing something I cannot. The Rangers never found a cabin in the area where they picked us up. No record exists of a woman named Hester living in the wilderness. The couple who went missing before me were eventually declared dead. Their bodies never recovered. But I know what happened to them, just as I know what nearly happened to Rusty and me. The mountains have appetites, and they must be fed. The balance must be maintained. For every life given, one must be taken in return. I've heard the high Uintas are particularly beautiful in summer, but if you go, stay on the marked trails. And if you hear singing, or if your campfire burns green, run. Run, and don't look back. The hollow is waiting, and Hester is always hungry for visitors. My name is Thomas Davis, and I am 34 years old. This happened in Lambs Canyon, just east of Salt Lake City, Utah. I've always considered myself a rational man. As a high school science teacher, I pride myself on logical thinking and finding reasonable explanations for seemingly inexplicable events. But what happened during that 3-day camping trip in the Wasatch Mountains defies every principle of rationality I've ever known. The trip was meant to be a much-needed escape. The divorce had been finalized just 2 weeks prior, and my colleagues at East High insisted I needed to clear my head. Ryan, our gym teacher, offered his family's remote cabin in Lambs Canyon as the perfect getaway spot. It was about 15 miles east of Salt Lake City, secluded enough to feel disconnected, but not so remote that we'd be completely isolated. At least, that's what we thought. There were 4 of us: Ryan, who organized everything; Marcus, our perpetually anxious but good-natured English teacher; Dominic, the stern vice principal who surprised everyone by agreeing to come; and myself. We'd all worked together for years, but had never spent significant time together outside of school. Perhaps that was our first mistake. The drive up was pleasant enough. We left straight after the final bell on Friday, taking Ryan's SUV through Parley's Canyon and then turning north into the less-traveled Lambs Canyon. The October air had a bite to it, and the aspens were ablaze with autumn colors, creating a picturesque scene that seemed almost too perfect. I remember thinking how the golden leaves caught the light in ways that made the entire forest seem to glow from within. "Cell service gets spotty up here," Ryan warned as we turned onto a dirt road that twisted deeper into the canyon. "But that's the point, right? To disconnect?" Marcus clutched his phone nervously. "Completely? I mean, what if there's an emergency?" "The cabin has a landline for emergencies," Ryan assured him. "It's the old type, connected to actual wires. Works even when the power's out." "Which happens often?" Dominic asked from the back seat, his deep voice carrying a note of concern that was unusual for him. Ryan laughed. "Only when the storms get bad. Weather reports clear for the weekend, though." I gazed out the window at the increasingly dense forest. The trees seemed to close in around us as we climbed higher, the road narrowing until it barely accommodated Ryan's vehicle. The sunlight filtered through branches in strange patterns, creating shifting shadows that danced across the dashboard. The cabin itself was rustic but comfortable. A 2-bedroom structure with a spacious living area, a stone fireplace, and a kitchen that had been updated sometime in the early 2000s. A wide deck wrapped around 3 sides, offering spectacular views of the canyon below. Behind the cabin, a hiking trail disappeared into the dense forest, promising adventure for the following day. "My grandfather built this place in the 1950s, Ryan explained as he unlocked the heavy wooden door. "Dad's been fixing it up over the years, but we've tried to keep it authentic." "It's great," I said, meaning it. After months of sleeping in a sterile apartment surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, the cabin felt solid, real. It smelled of pine and wood smoke and something else, something earthy and old. We settled in quickly, claiming bedrooms and unloading supplies. Ryan and I would share one room with twin beds, while Marcus and Dominic took the other. As I unpacked, I noticed an old photograph on the bedside table, a black and white image of a stern-faced man standing in front of the cabin, which looked newer in the picture but otherwise unchanged. A dog sat at the man's feet, its eyes strangely bright in the faded photograph. "Your grandfather?" I asked Ryan, pointing to the picture. He glanced over and frowned slightly. "Yeah, that's him. Walter Jenkins. Mean old bastard from what I hear. Dad doesn't talk about him much." "And the dog?" "No idea. Didn't know he had one." Ryan shrugged. "Probably just a hunting dog. Gramps was big on hunting." After a dinner of grilled steaks and beer on the deck, we sat around the fireplace, the crackling flames casting long shadows on the log walls. The conversation flowed easily, helped along by more beer and the natural camaraderie that forms when people escape their usual environment together. "So," Marcus said during a lull, "are there any local legends about this place? Ghost stories? Every good cabin needs a ghost story." Ryan took a long pull from his beer before answering. "Well, there is something the locals talk about. Nothing to do with the cabin specifically, but this whole area of the Wasatch Range." We all leaned in instinctively, the fire popping as if on cue. "They call it the Lamb's Wrath," Ryan continued, his voice dropping. "Story goes that back in the 1800s, there was a family named Lamb who homesteaded in this canyon. Husband, wife, 3 kids. One harsh winter, they got snowed in badly, ran out of food by January. By the time spring came and people could reach their cabin, they found the wife alone, surrounded by bones that had been picked clean." "Jesus," Marcus whispered. "She claimed it was starvation, that they died one by one and she'd had no choice but to survive on what was available. But the investigation found that at least one of the children had been killed before the food ran out." Ryan's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "They hanged her in Salt Lake City, but locals say her spirit returned to the canyon. They say she still roams these woods, looking for company in her eternal isolation." A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the eaves of the cabin. "That's bullshit," Dominic said flatly. "I've lived in Utah my entire life and never heard that story." Ryan grinned. "Maybe. Maybe not. Dad told me never to hike alone up here, though. Said people go missing in these mountains more often than the Park Service admits." "On that cheery note," I said, standing up, "I'm getting another beer. Anyone else?" The rest of the evening passed pleasantly enough, though I noticed Marcus glancing nervously at the darkened windows from time to time. We turned in around midnight, tired from the drive and full of food and alcohol. I dreamed of running through endless trees, pursued by something I couldn't see but could sense behind me, something with hot breath and the smell of rot. I woke with a start around 3 a.m., the cabin silent except for Ryan's soft snoring in the bed across from mine. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the photograph on the nightstand. I could have sworn the dog in the picture had changed position, now standing rather than sitting. I blinked, and it was as I remembered it. "Just the beer," I told myself, turning away from the photo. But sleep eluded me after that, and I lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest until dawn began to lighten the sky. The next morning was bright and clear, perfect hiking weather. After a breakfast of bacon and eggs, we packed day packs with water, energy bars, and first aid supplies. "There's a great trail that leads up to Millview Peak," Ryan said, spreading a topographical map across the kitchen table. "It's about a 6-mile round trip, moderate difficulty. The views are incredible." "Sounds good to me," I said, eager to stretch my legs and clear my head. Marcus and Dominic agreed, and by 9 a.m., we were on the trail. The hike started pleasantly enough. The trail wound through aspen groves where golden leaves quivered in the breeze, then into denser pine forest. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of sap and earth. Birds called from the canopy above, and occasionally we spotted squirrels darting among the undergrowth. "I needed this," I admitted as we paused at a small stream to refill our water bottles. "Being out here, away from everything, It helps put things in perspective. Divorce is rough, Ryan said sympathetically, but you'll get through it. It's been a year since Caroline left, Marcus added, his voice soft. Still feels like yesterday sometimes. I glanced at him, surprised. I hadn't known his marriage had ended too. The trail grew steeper as we continued, and conversation dwindled as we focused on our footing. After about 2 hours, we reached a rocky outcropping that offered a spectacular view of the canyon below and the distant peaks of the Wasatch Range. Perfect lunch spot, Ryan declared, shrugging off his pack. We settled on the sun-warmed rocks and broke out sandwiches and trail mix. The conversation flowed easily. Talk of school and students, sports, and movies. Normal things that grounded us in the everyday world even as we sat surrounded by wilderness. It was as we were packing up to continue that Marcus frowned, looking around. "Do you hear that?" We fell silent, listening. At first, I heard nothing unusual, just the whisper of wind through pines and the distant call of a hawk. But then I caught it, a faint sound like humming or singing, so soft it might have been imagination. "Probably just the wind," Dominic said dismissively. But the sound persisted as we continued our hike, sometimes fading completely, other times growing slightly louder. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a melodic murmur just at the edge of hearing. The trail narrowed as we climbed higher, forcing us to walk single file. Ryan led, followed by Dominic, then Marcus, with me bringing up the rear. The trees grew denser, blocking much of the sunlight and creating a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. I was lost in thought, mechanically putting one foot in front of the other when I realized I couldn't see Marcus ahead of me anymore. I stopped, confused. The trail ahead curved around a massive boulder, and I assumed he'd simply gone around it, but an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. "Marcus!" I called, quickening my pace. No answer. I rounded the boulder and found myself alone on the trail. Ahead and behind, there was no sign of my companions. Panic fluttered in my chest. "Ryan! Dominic! Marcus!" I shouted, my voice echoing among the trees. Nothing. Then, faintly, the humming again, slightly to my right, off the trail. Without thinking, I moved toward it, pushing through dense underbrush. The humming grew louder, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, singing a melody I almost recognized but couldn't quite place. The undergrowth suddenly opened into a small clearing dominated by an enormous old pine tree. Its trunk was gnarled and twisted, its bark deeply furrowed. At its base sat a woman in old-fashioned clothing, a long, dark dress with a high collar, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was bent over something in her lap, her hands moving rhythmically as she hummed. "Excuse me," I said, relief flooding through me at finding another person. "I've lost my group. Have you seen 3 other hikers pass this way?" She didn't look up or acknowledge me in any way, just continued her work and her humming. I stepped closer, suddenly aware of the unnatural stillness of the clearing. No birds called here, no insects buzzed. Even the air felt heavy and stagnant. "Ma'am?" I tried again, moving cautiously toward her. When I was about 10 feet away, she finally raised her head. Her face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes deep-set and dark. But it was her mouth that made my blood run cold. Her lips were stitched shut with what looked like black thread, the skin puckered and raw around the crude sutures. Yet the humming continued, emanating not from her mouth but seeming to come from the air around her. I stumbled backward in horror, my heel catching on a root. As I fell, the woman stood in one fluid motion, revealing what she held in her lap. A length of intestine, glistening wetly in the dim light. She held it like yarn, her fingers working to twist it into something as one might knit with wool. I scrambled to my feet and ran, crashing blindly through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. I had no idea which direction would lead back to the trail. I only knew I needed to get away from that clearing, from that woman with her sewn mouth and her grisly handicraft. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, finally collapsing against a tree trunk, gasping for breath. As my panic subsided enough for rational thought to return, I realized I was completely lost. The forest looked the same in every direction, endless trunks creating a disorienting maze. The sun, what little I could see of it through the canopy, offered no help. I couldn't tell which direction was which. "Thomas!" The sound of my name jolted me upright. It was Ryan's voice, distant but clear. "Here," I shouted back. "I'm over here." I heard crashing through undergrowth, and then Ryan appeared, followed closely by Dominic and Marcus. Their faces showed a mixture of relief and irritation. "What the hell, man?" Ryan demanded. "We turned around and you were just gone?" I started, then hesitated. How could I explain what I'd seen? I thought you guys had gone ahead. I tried to catch up, but must have taken a wrong turn. "We've been looking for you for over an hour," Dominic said, checking his watch. "It's almost 3 p.m. I blinked in confusion. It couldn't have been more than 15 minutes since I'd lost sight of them. But the shadows had indeed lengthened considerably, and the light had the golden quality of late afternoon. "Sorry," I muttered. "I got disoriented." "You okay?" Marcus asked, eyeing me with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," I lied, "just tired and annoyed with myself for getting lost." Ryan sighed. "Well, we're not going to make it to the peak and back before dark now. We should head back to the cabin." The return journey was tense and mostly silent. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the woman following us. The humming had stopped, but in its place was a pressure in my ears, as if I were deep underwater. By the time we reached the cabin, dusk was falling, and a chill had crept into the air. Inside, Ryan built a fire while Dominic started dinner, pasta with jarred sauce, simple, but comforting. I retreated to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face and trying to convince myself that what I'd seen in the clearing had been a hallucination brought on by dehydration or altitude. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw thin scratches on my face and neck, evidence of my panicked flight through the underbrush, and caught in my shirt collar was a single black thread, similar to what had been used to sew the woman's mouth closed. I rejoined the others with forced casualness, trying to act normal as we ate dinner and then gathered around the fire with beers. The conversation was subdued, everyone tired from the day's exertions. "So, what really happened out there today?" Ryan asked suddenly, fixing me with a steady gaze. "What do you mean?" I replied, my mouth dry. "Come on, Thomas. You don't just wander off trail for no reason. What spooked you?" I took a long swallow of beer, debating internally. These were rational men. They'd think I was crazy if I told them the truth. But something in Ryan's expression made me think he might not be entirely surprised by my answer. "I heard singing," I said finally. "A woman humming. I followed the sound off trail and found someone." "Someone," Dominic echoed skeptically. "A woman in old-fashioned clothes. She was sitting under a big pine tree. Her mouth was sewn shut, but I could still hear her humming. I couldn't bring myself to mention what she'd been doing with her hands, the glistening rope of intestine." Silence fell over the room. Marcus looked frightened, Dominic skeptical, but Ryan's expression was unreadable. "Did she speak to you?" Ryan asked, his voice oddly tight. "No, she just looked at me, and then I ran." Ryan nodded slowly. "My dad saw her once," he said quietly. "Or someone like her. When he was about my age, he was hunting alone, which his father, my grandfather, had strictly forbidden. Got lost in a snowstorm and took shelter under a big pine. Said he woke up to find a woman sitting next to him, humming and sewing something he couldn't see clearly in the dark." "What happened?" Marcus whispered. "Nothing, according to him. He passed out from cold, and when he woke up at dawn, she was gone. But he made it back to the cabin when he should have frozen to death, and he never went into those woods alone again." It was obviously just someone messing with hikers, Dominic said firmly. Some local weirdo who gets off on scaring tourists. Maybe, Ryan conceded, but the locals say it's Elizabeth Lamb, the woman from the story I told last night. They say she appears to lost hikers. Sometimes she leads them to safety, sometimes to their deaths. Depends on her mood, I guess. This is ridiculous. Dominic stood up abruptly. I'm going to bed, and tomorrow we stick together on the trails. No wandering off. He gave me a pointed look before leaving the room. Marcus followed soon after, looking pale and shaken. Ryan and I sat in silence for a while, watching the fire die down to embers. You believe me, I said finally. It wasn't a question. Ryan shrugged. I believe you saw something that scared you. Whether it was Elizabeth Lamb or some weirdo in costume or just altitude sickness, I don't know. But my dad wasn't the type to make up stories, and neither are you. He stood, stretching. Get some sleep, Thomas. Things always look clearer in the morning. But sleep proved elusive once again. I lay awake, listening to Ryan's steady breathing, watching moonlight create shifting patterns on the ceiling. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise from the main room of the cabin, a soft thud, as if something had been set down on the wooden floor. I froze, straining to hear more. Footsteps. Light and careful, moving across the main room toward the bedrooms. It could be Marcus or Dominic getting a drink of water, I reasoned, but a deeper part of me knew it wasn't. The footsteps stopped outside our bedroom door. I held my breath, eyes fixed on the door handle. It began to turn, slowly, the mechanism making a faint clicking sound in the silence. The door opened a crack, allowing a sliver of silvery moonlight to spill across the floor. Through the narrow opening, I could see a pale hand gripping the edge of the door, the fingers long and thin, the knuckles swollen and misshapen. The hand was filthy, dirt embedded under the nails, and there was something dark, dried blood, crusted around the cuticles. I wanted to wake Ryan, to call out, to do something, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, able only to watch as the door inched wider, as a face began to appear in the gap, gaunt and pale in the moonlight, with those same deep-set eyes I'd seen in the forest. The stitched mouth was stretched in what might have been an attempt at a smile, causing small beads of blood to form where the thread pulled against skin. Our eyes met across the darkened room, and I felt something cold and alien touch my mind, a presence that was ancient and full of patient malice. It pushed into my thoughts, sifting through memories and emotions with casual cruelty. Images flashed through my mind. My ex-wife walking out the door for the last time, my father in his hospital bed, wasted by cancer, the stray dog I'd found as a child, hit by a car and dying in my arms, all the moments of loss and grief in my life, suddenly fresh and raw. And beneath these memories, I sensed the woman's hunger, not physical hunger, but a desperate, consuming need for companionship. For someone to stay with her, forever, in these endless woods. The pressure in my head built until I thought my skull would crack. Just as darkness began to creep in at the edges of my vision, Ryan turned in his sleep, mumbling something incoherent. The presence in my mind vanished, and the door closed silently, the pale face and hand withdrawing into the darkness beyond. I lay gasping, cold sweat soaking the sheets beneath me. Outside the bedroom, I heard those careful footsteps retreating, followed by the front door opening and closing with a soft click. The rest of the night passed in a state of rigid wakefulness. I didn't dare move from my bed, didn't dare close my eyes. When dawn finally came, I felt hollowed out, as if something essential had been scooped from inside me. At breakfast, I noticed all three of my companions looked as exhausted as I felt. Dark circles shadowed their eyes, and conversation was minimal, limited to practical concerns about the day ahead. I think we should leave, Marcus said suddenly, setting down his coffee mug with a sharp click. Cut the trip short. Head back to the city today. Because Thomas saw someone in the woods? Dominic scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. It was probably just a hiker." "It's not that," Marcus insisted. I heard something last night. Someone in the cabin." Ryan and I exchanged glances. "What time?" I asked quietly. "Around 2, maybe. I woke up and heard footsteps." Marcus looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly. "And there was humming. The same melody Thomas mentioned, I think." "Did you see anything?" Ryan asked. Marcus shook his head. "I was too scared to get up, but I know someone was in our room. I could feel them standing by my bed, watching me, and I had these dreams." He broke off, swallowing hard. "What kind of dreams?" I prompted gently. "Bad ones. About my wife leaving, about my brother's accident, things I try not to think about." Marcus looked up, his eyes haunted. "It felt like something was feeding on them, on the pain, enjoying it." Dominic pushed his plate away, his face pale. "This is mass hysteria," he said, but his usual authoritative tone was absent. "We're suggestible. Ryan tells a ghost story. Thomas thinks he sees something, and now we're all jumping at shadows." "What about you, Dom?" Ryan asked. "Sleep well?" Dominic hesitated, then sighed heavily. "No," he admitted. "I had dreams, but it doesn't mean anything. We're all stressed, tired. The mind plays tricks." "We could leave," Ryan said slowly. "Pack up now and be back in Salt Lake by noon." Part of me desperately wanted to agree, to flee back to the safety and rationality of the city. But something stronger, curiosity perhaps, or a stubborn refusal to be driven away by fear, made me shake my head. "It's our last day," I said. "Let's stick to the plan. One more hike, then we head back tomorrow morning as scheduled." Ryan studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Majority rules. Dom? Marcus?" Dominic shrugged. "I'm fine with staying. It's just one more night." Marcus looked less certain, but eventually nodded. "Okay, but we stay together today. No one goes off alone, not even to take a leak." We chose a different trail that day, one that led along a ridge offering views of the entire canyon. It was less strenuous than the previous day's hike, and we maintained a slower pace, staying close together as promised. No one mentioned Elizabeth Lamb or the events of the night before, as if by unspoken agreement. The day was overcast, the sky a uniform gray that muted the autumn colors and cast a somber pall over the landscape. The wind had picked up, sending dry leaves skittering along the path and creating eerie whistling sounds as it moved through the trees. Despite our agreement to stay together, tensions began to fray as the day wore on. Dominic and Ryan got into a heated argument about school policy that seemed to be about something deeper, something personal. Marcus grew increasingly jumpy, flinching at every snapped twig or sudden gust of wind. And I felt a creeping paranoia, constantly scanning the trees around us, convinced we were being watched. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and the wind carried the scent of rain. We decided to cut the hike short and return to the cabin before the storm hit. We were perhaps a mile from the cabin when Marcus stopped abruptly, cocking his head to the side. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. We all stopped to listen. At first, there was only the sound of the wind. Then I caught it, that now familiar humming, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere ahead of us on the trail. "It's just the wind in the trees," Dominic said, but he made no move to continue forward. "It's her," Marcus whispered. "She's between us and the cabin." Ryan pulled out his phone. "No service, of course," he muttered, shoving it back in his pocket. "We can go around," I suggested, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "Leave the trail, circle wide, and approach the cabin from the back." Ryan hesitated, then nodded. "Worth a try. This way." He led us off the trail into the dense forest, moving perpendicular to our original path. The going was much tougher here, with no clear path through the underbrush and fallen logs. The humming faded as we moved away from the trail, which should have been reassuring but somehow wasn't, After about 20 minutes of difficult progress, the first raindrops began to fall. Fat, cold splats that quickly turned into a steady downpour. Within minutes, we were soaked through, visibility reduced to just a few yards ahead. "We need to find shelter," Ryan shouted over the increasing roar of the rain. "Which way to the cabin?" Marcus called back, wiping water from his eyes. Ryan's expression was grim. "I'm not sure. I think we've been moving roughly parallel to the trail, but in this rain." A flash of lightning illuminated the forest, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. We instinctively huddled closer together, scanning our surroundings for any possible shelter. "There." Dominic pointed to a dark shape maybe 50 yards away, a rocky overhang forming a shallow cave in the hillside. We made for it, slipping on wet leaves and mud. The overhang wasn't deep, maybe 6 feet at its furthest point, but it was enough to get us out of the direct downpour. We crowded beneath it, shivering and dripping. "We should have left this morning," Marcus said, his teeth chattering. "I knew something bad was going to happen." "It's just a storm," Dominic replied, but without conviction. "It'll pass." I peered out at the deluge. The rain was falling so heavily that it created a curtain of water off the edge of our small shelter, isolating us further from the world beyond. Lightning flashed again, casting strange shadows among the trees. "Once it lets up, we'll get our bearings and find the cabin," Ryan said firmly. "It can't be more than half a mile away in a straight line." We fell silent, listening to the storm and trying to conserve body heat. As the minutes dragged on, I found myself drifting into an exhausted daze, lulled by the steady drum of rain on rock. I don't know how long I sat there, hovering on the edge of sleep, before I became aware of a new sound cutting through the storm. That soft, insistent humming, closer now than ever before. My eyes snapped open. Through the curtain of rain, a figure stood watching us. The woman in her old-fashioned dress, now plastered to her skeletal frame by the downpour. Her gray hair hung in wet ropes around her face, partially obscuring those terrible stitches across her mouth. "She's here," I whispered hoarsely. The others followed my gaze, tensing as they spotted her. She made no move toward us, just stood in the rain, humming that maddening melody that somehow carried clearly over the storm. "What does she want?" Marcus's voice was barely audible, his face white with terror. "Company," I replied, remembering the hungry presence I'd felt in my mind the night before. "She's lonely." As if in response to my words, the woman took a step toward our shelter, then another. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being manipulated by unseen strings. "Stay back!" Ryan shouted, grabbing a fallen branch and brandishing it like a club. The woman paused, tilting her head curiously. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of rain. Then, with movements too fast to follow, she was suddenly at the edge of our shelter, her pale hand reaching toward us, water dripping from her fingertips. Dominic was closest to her. He recoiled, pressing his back against the rock wall, but there was nowhere to retreat. Her hand brushed his face in what might have been a caress, leaving smears of dirt and something darker across his cheek. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Dominic's body went rigid, his eyes rolling back to show only whites. He began to convulse violently, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. "Dom!" Ryan lunged forward, trying to grab him, but the woman moved with that same unnatural speed, interposing herself between them. Now that she was fully under the overhang with us, I could see her more clearly, and wished I couldn't. Her skin had a greenish cast to it, like something long dead but refused burial. The stitches in her mouth were crusted with old blood and pus, the flesh around them inflamed and necrotic. And her eyes. Her eyes were not human eyes at all, but something ancient and cold and hungry. She reached for Ryan next, but he swung the branch, connecting solidly with her midsection. There was a wet, sickening sound, like rotten fruit being crushed. The woman staggered back a step but didn't fall. Instead, She looked down almost curiously at the dark fluid seeping from the wound, then back up at Ryan with those inhuman eyes. The humming resumed, louder now, reverberating off the rock walls of our small shelter until it filled my head like physical pain. Marcus covered his ears, screaming, though I could barely hear him over the awful noise. Dominic had stopped convulsing and now lay still, his chest barely rising and falling. I dropped to my knees beside him, frantically checking for a pulse while trying to keep one eye on the woman. His skin was cold and clammy, his pulse thready and irregular. "We need to get him out of here," I shouted to Ryan over the humming. "Back to the cabin. Call for help." Ryan nodded grimly, still holding the branch between us and the woman. On 3, we grab Dom and run. 1, 2, 3. I hooked my arms under Dominic's shoulders while Ryan grabbed his legs. Marcus, seemingly galvanized by the plan, positioned himself to help shield us as we moved. Together, we burst out from under the overhang into the continuing downpour. The woman made no move to follow immediately, which was both a relief and somehow more terrifying. We struggled through the mud with Dominic's dead weight between us, heading in what we hoped was the direction of the cabin. "Look for landmarks," Ryan gasped as we stumbled along. "Anything familiar?" But the storm had transformed the landscape into an alien world of shadows and sheets of rain. Every tree looked the same, every rock and hollow indistinguishable from the next. We were completely lost. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we had to stop, our arms burning from carrying Dominic. We set him down as gently as possible under a large pine that offered minimal shelter from the rain. "He's getting worse," I said, checking Dominic's pulse again. It was weaker than before, his breathing shallow and labored. "We need to find the cabin," Ryan insisted, looking frantically in all directions. "The first aid kit, the landline." "We're going in circles," Marcus said suddenly, his voice oddly calm. "Look." He pointed to a distinctive lightning-scarred tree trunk nearby. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. We had passed that same tree at least twice before. "She's doing this," Marcus continued in that same detached tone. "She's making us lost, wanting us to give up, to stay." As if conjured by his words, the humming started again, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Through the curtain of rain, I could see dark shapes moving among the trees, not just one figure now, but many, circling us like wolves around prey. "We need to keep moving," Ryan said, his voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. "We can't just wait here to die." "But which way?" I asked desperately. "We don't even know which direction the cabin is." Marcus had gone very still, his head cocked as if listening to something beyond the humming. "I know the way," he said finally, his voice strange and distant. "She told me." Before we could react, he turned and began walking purposefully into the forest, away from us. "Marcus," I called after him. "Wait, we need to stay together." He didn't slow or look back, quickly disappearing into the gloom of the storm. Ryan and I exchanged horrified glances. "We can't just let him go," I said. "We can't leave Dom either," Ryan countered. A terrible choice confronted us. Split up, with one of us going after Marcus while the other stayed with Dominic, or abandon our friend to his fate and stick together. "You go," Ryan decided, his jaw set. "I'll stay with Dom. Try to keep him stable. Find Marcus and get to the cabin if you can." "And if I can't find him, or the cabin?" Ryan met my gaze steadily. "Then get to the main road any way you can. Flag down help." The prospect of going alone into the storm, with those shapes circling in the trees, made my stomach clench with fear. But we were out of options. "Okay," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I'll find him, and I'll come back for you both." Ryan nodded, huddling closer to Dominic's still form. "Be careful, Thomas. Don't let her touch you." I squeezed his shoulder once, then turned and plunged into the forest in the direction Marcus had gone. The rain had lessened slightly, but visibility was still poor, and the ground was treacherous with mud and hidden roots. I moved as quickly as I dared, calling Marcus's name every few steps. The humming followed me, sometimes fading, sometimes growing louder, but never quite disappearing. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on finding any sign of Marcus's passage. Broken twigs, footprints in the mud, anything. After about 10 minutes, I spotted something ahead, a flash of color against the browns and greens of the forest floor. Drawing closer, I recognized Marcus's red rain jacket, discarded and half buried in mud. My heart sank. Why would he remove his jacket in this weather unless he was no longer thinking rationally, or no longer himself? I picked up the jacket, noticing with growing horror that it was torn across the back, as if by claws or knife slashes. There was no blood, at least none that I could discern in the rain, but that did little to ease my fears. "Marcus!" I shouted, desperation overwhelming caution. "Marcus!" The only answer was the humming, closer now, and the patter of rain on leaves. I pressed on, clutching his jacket like a talisman. The forest seemed to be growing darker, though it was still mid-afternoon. The storm clouds had deepened to an ominous black, and the trees here were older, denser, blocking what little light remained. I almost missed the next sign, a shoe, Marcus's hiking boot, lying on its side next to a fallen log. Like the jacket, it appeared to have been deliberately removed and discarded. I picked it up, noting with confusion that it was completely dry despite the downpour. The humming had changed, I realized. The melody was the same, but there were now multiple voices singing it in discordant harmony, a chorus of inhuman voices that made my skin crawl and my vision blur at the edges. I stumbled onward, following a trail of discarded items, Marcus's other shoe, his watch, his wallet, like breadcrumbs leading deeper into the forest. Each item was pristine, untouched by the rain or mud, as if they had just been placed there moments before. The trees suddenly opened up into a clearing I recognized with a jolt of terror, the same clearing I'd found the day before, dominated by that massive, twisted pine tree. But the scene was different now. Where there had been just one figure before, there were now several, pale, gaunt forms in various states of decay, all with their mouths sewn shut, all humming that same maddening tune. And in their midst, kneeling in the mud, was Marcus. His clothes were gone except for his underwear, and he was digging in the sodden earth with his bare hands, scooping mud aside to create a shallow hole. His movements were mechanical, his eyes vacant, his lips moving silently in time with the humming. Around the clearing, partially hidden by underbrush and shadows, I could see other holes, some fresh, others old and overgrown. From some of these rose pale hands or feet, as if their occupants had been buried upright and were now gradually emerging from the earth. The woman, Elizabeth Lamb, if Ryan's story was to be believed, stood behind Marcus, one skeletal hand resting on his shoulder. She was watching his work with something like maternal pride on her ruined face. I crouched at the edge of the clearing, paralyzed by horror and indecision. Marcus was clearly under some kind of control, and there were at least 5 other figures in the clearing besides Elizabeth. I couldn't hope to overcome them all or break whatever hold they had on my friend. But I couldn't leave him either. As I wrestled with this impossible choice, Elizabeth's head snapped up, her inhuman eyes locking directly on my hiding place. The humming stopped abruptly. Every figure in the clearing turned as one to stare in my direction. Marcus stopped digging and rose slowly to his feet, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette with tangled strings. His eyes, when they found mine, showed a moment of recognition, of desperate pleading, before clouding over again with that vacant stare. "Thomas," he said, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. "Join us. Stay with us. She's so lonely." Elizabeth moved toward me with that unnatural speed, covering half the distance between us before I could even react. I stumbled backward, turning to run, but my foot caught on a root and I fell hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. She loomed over me, those stitched lips somehow stretching into a grotesque smile. Her hand reached for my face, inches away, the nails long and crusted with dirt and darker things. A gunshot cracked through the forest, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Elizabeth jerked backward, dark fluid spraying from a wound in her chest. She looked down at it with that same curious expression I'd seen earlier, then back up at something behind me. I twisted around to see Ryan standing at the edge of the clearing, a hunting rifle in his hands, his face a mask of grim determination. He worked the bolt, chambering another round, and fired again. This shot caught Elizabeth in the shoulder, spinning her halfway around. The other figures were moving now, converging on Ryan with terrible purpose. He fired again and again, each shot finding its mark but doing little to slow their advance. They were too many, too inhuman. "Run!" he shouted to me. "Get to the cabin. The keys are in my jacket pocket." I scrambled to my feet, hesitating. "What about you? And Marcus?" "I'll get Marcus. Just go." Something in his voice, a note of finality, of sacrifice, told me he didn't expect to make it out of this clearing, but he was giving me a chance, and I had to take it. I ran. Behind me, the gunshots continued, punctuated by shouts and that awful humming, which had resumed at a higher pitch, almost a scream now. I crashed through the forest blindly, branches whipping my face, mud sucking at my boots. The storm had intensified again, lightning splitting the sky in jagged bursts that briefly illuminated my path. I had no idea if I was heading in the right direction. I only knew I had to put as much distance as possible between myself and that clearing. A fallen tree blocked my path, and as I vaulted over it, my ankle twisted painfully. I landed hard on the other side, a cry of pain escaping my lips. Forcing myself up, I tested the ankle, not broken, but badly sprained. I could still walk, still run if I had to, but each step sent shooting pain up my leg. I pressed on, limping now, the sounds from the clearing growing fainter behind me. The rain had plastered my clothes to my body, and I was shivering uncontrollably, as much from shock and fear as from cold. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm me, the certainty that I was hopelessly lost, that I would wander these woods until I collapsed from exhaustion or was found by Elizabeth and her macabre family, I saw something through the trees ahead, a straight line, too regular to be natural. A roof. The cabin. Somehow, in my panicked flight, I had stumbled upon it. I redoubled my pace, ignoring the pain in my ankle, hope giving me a last burst of energy. As I broke through the final line of trees, the cabin stood before me, solid, real, a beacon of safety in the gathering darkness. I practically fell against the front door, fumbling in my pocket for Ryan's keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the lock, but finally the door swung open. I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me and throwing the deadbolt. The cabin was dark and silent, the power apparently knocked out by the storm. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my mind racing. I needed to call for help. Ryan had mentioned a landline for emergencies. I limped through the darkened main room, using the brief flashes of lightning through the windows to navigate. The phone was in the kitchen, an old rotary model mounted on the wall. I lifted the receiver to my ear, praying for a dial tone. Silence. The line was dead. Panic threatened to overwhelm me again. I was trapped here, injured, with no way to call for help. And outside, somewhere in the storm-lashed forest, Ryan was fighting a losing battle against Elizabeth Lamb and her undead companions, trying to save Marcus, who might already be beyond saving. I had to think. There must be something I could use. A radio, emergency supplies, anything. I began searching the cabin methodically, starting with the kitchen drawers. I found matches, candles, a flashlight that thankfully still worked. Its beam cut through the gloom, making the shadows leap and dance along the walls. In a cabinet beneath the sink, I discovered a first aid kit. I took it to the living room and sat on the couch, elevating my throbbing ankle on a cushion and examining the supplies. There was an ace bandage, which I used to wrap my ankle tightly, and some ibuprofen for the pain. As I worked, I tried to form a plan. The storm would eventually pass. When it did, I would make for the main road. It couldn't be more than a few miles. From there, I could flag down a passing car or walk to the nearest town. Send help back for Ryan and the others if they were still. I couldn't finish the thought. A noise from outside froze me in place, a soft thud on the deck like a footstep. Then another. Someone, or something, was walking around the cabin. I extinguished the flashlight immediately, plunging the room into darkness. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, and moving from the deck to the side of the cabin, then around to the back. Testing each window, each potential entrance. I sat motionless in the dark, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps completed their circuit of the cabin and returned to the front. There was a long pause, then a soft scraping at the door, not like someone knocking, but like nails or claws being drawn across the wood. "Thomas." The voice was Ryan's, but wrong somehow, flat and empty, like Marcus's had been in the clearing. "Let me in, Thomas. I'm hurt." I bit down hard on my lip to keep from responding. It wasn't Ryan. It couldn't be. Whatever was outside, it wasn't my friend. "Please, Thomas. It's cold out here. I'm bleeding. She's coming. Let me in." The voice was more desperate now, more convincing. For a moment, I almost believed it, my hand half raising toward the deadbolt. Then I remembered Marcus's vacant eyes, his mechanical movements. If Ryan had been taken like that, Thomas. The voice changed, becoming Marcus's. "She has us, Thomas. She'll keep us forever unless you help. Let us in. Let us show you what we found." I remained silent, my heart hammering in my chest. The voices continued, alternating between Marcus and Ryan, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening. Occasionally, I heard Dominic's voice too, though it was weaker, more distant. The storm raged on, the wind howling around the eaves of the cabin, rain lashing against the windows. Time seemed to stretch and distort. I had no idea if hours had passed or just minutes. I drifted in and out of a daze, exhaustion warring with fear to keep me in a state of hyper-vigilant stupor. At some point, I must have fallen into a deeper sleep because I woke with a start to silence. The storm had passed, and weak daylight filtered through the windows. Morning had come. I sat up cautiously, wincing at the stiffness in my body and the renewed pain in my ankle. The cabin was silent, no sound of voices or footsteps outside. After listening intently for several minutes, I dared to turn the flashlight back on, its beam pale and weak in the growing daylight. The cabin appeared undisturbed. No broken windows, no forced entries. Whatever had been outside during the night had not managed to get in, or had not tried very hard to do so. That thought was somehow more disturbing than the alternative. I rose gingerly, testing my ankle. The pain was still there, but manageable with the tight wrapping. I made my way to the front window and peered out cautiously. The forest was transformed by the storm. Branches down everywhere, leaves stripped from trees, the ground a sea of mud. But there was no sign of movement, no pale figures standing among the trees, just the ordinary devastation left by a powerful storm. I needed to leave now, while daylight gave me some advantage. I gathered what supplies I could find, a bottle of water, some energy bars from our hiking packs, a heavy flashlight that could double as a weapon if needed. I found Ryan's car keys where he had left them on the kitchen counter. The SUV was still parked outside, undamaged by the storm. If I could reach it, I could drive straight down to the main road to safety. It was maybe 30 yards from the cabin door to the vehicle. A short distance, but one that would leave me terribly exposed. I stood at the window for a long time, scanning the tree line, looking for any movement, any sign of watching eyes. Nothing. The forest was still, almost peaceful in the morning light. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the deadbolt and eased the door open, inch by inch. The hinges creaked slightly, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. I paused, listening. Still nothing. I stepped out onto the deck, my senses straining for any hint of danger. The air was fresh and clean after the storm, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Birds were singing somewhere in the distance, an ordinary, reassuring sound that gave me courage. I moved as quickly as my injured ankle would allow, keeping my eyes on the tree line as I limped toward the SUV. Each step seemed to take an eternity, the distance stretching impossibly before me. But finally, I reached the vehicle, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking with relief and lingering fear. The door unlocked with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet morning. I climbed in, locked the doors immediately, and shoved the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, rumbling to life. I nearly wept with relief. As I shifted into reverse, movement caught my eye. At the edge of the forest, partially hidden behind a massive pine tree, a pale figure stood watching. Elizabeth Lamb, her dress now in tatters, dark fluid still seeping from the wounds Ryan's bullets had made. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood Ryan, his clothes torn and bloody, his eyes vacant, his mouth now sewn shut with the same crude black stitches she wore, and beside him, Marcus and Dominic, similarly transformed, their faces bearing the same empty expression. They made no move to approach the vehicle. They just stood watching as I backed away, turned the SUV around, and accelerated down the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, I could see them growing smaller, 4 still figures at the edge of the forest, until a bend in the road took them out of sight. I drove recklessly fast on the rough track, desperate to reach the main road, civilization, other people. When the paved road finally appeared ahead, I almost couldn't believe it. I turned onto it, heading east toward Salt Lake City, pushing the SUV well above the speed limit. I stopped at the first gas station I found, a small place just off the highway with a single attendant, an older man who looked up in alarm as I limped in, disheveled and wild-eyed. "Phone," I gasped. "I need to use your phone. There's been an accident." He wordlessly pointed to an old payphone at the side of the building. I called 911, reporting that 3 hikers were missing in Lamb's Canyon, possibly injured. I gave them the coordinates of the cabin as best I could remember, described the situation, omitting the supernatural elements, saying only that we had been separated in the storm. The dispatcher promised to send search and rescue teams immediately. I hung up, leaning against the payphone booth, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion and delayed shock. The attendant was watching me curiously when I re-entered the store. "You okay, son? You look like you've been through hell." "Got caught in the storm," I mumbled. "Got separated from my friends. Search and rescue is going to look for them." He nodded sympathetically. "Nasty storm last night. One of the worst we've had up here in years." He hesitated, then asked, "Where exactly were you folks camping?" "Lamb's Canyon," I replied, "a private cabin up there." His expression changed subtly, a flicker of something. Recognition? Fear? Crossing his weathered face. "Jenkins' place?" I nodded, surprised. "You know it?" "Everybody around here knows it," he said quietly. "Or knows to stay away from it, more like." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with my wet clothes or exhaustion. "Why's that?" He seemed to debate with himself before answering. "There's stories about that canyon. Old stories. People going missing over the years. Hikers, mostly. Folks who don't know the history." "Elizabeth Lamb," I said, the name feeling like poison on my tongue. "The woman who ate her family." The attendant's eyes widened slightly. "So you know the story." "Some of it. Is it true?" He shrugged, but his casual gesture was belied by the tension in his shoulders. "True enough, I reckon. Elizabeth Lamb was hanged in 1879 for killing and partially eating her husband and 3 children during a harsh winter. They found human remains in her stew pot." He paused, glancing out the window toward the mountains. "But that's not the whole story." "What's the rest?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "The hangman botched it. Her neck didn't break clean, and she strangled slow. Took nearly 15 minutes for her to die. And the whole time, She was laughing, they say. Laughing and promising she'd be waiting for company up in her canyon. He shook his head. Old story. Probably just a tale to scare kids away from hiking alone. And the Jenkins place? I pressed. What's its connection? Walter Jenkins built that cabin back in the 50s, right about where the original Lamb homestead had stood, though I doubt he knew it at the time. People warned him, but he was stubborn. The attendant's voice dropped lower. His son found him dead in the cabin a year later. Official cause was heart attack, but there were stories about the condition of the body, about stitches. I felt sick, remembering the photograph on the nightstand. Walter Jenkins standing in front of the newly built cabin, the dog at his feet. The cabin that his grandson Ryan had inherited, and to which he had unwittingly brought us. "Your friends," the attendant said, studying my face. "They still up there?" I nodded, unable to speak. "Then I'm sorry, son." His voice was gentle, full of genuine regret. "But they ain't coming back, not as themselves anyway." I stayed at the gas station until the search and rescue team arrived, following them back to Lamb's Canyon in Ryan's SUV to show them where to go. But I refused to accompany them up to the cabin. Nothing on earth could have made me return to those woods. The search lasted 3 days. They found the cabin undisturbed, our belongings still there, Ryan's rifle laying in the mud about half a mile into the forest. Of Ryan, Marcus, and Dominic, they found no trace. No bodies, no blood, no evidence of what had happened to them. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead from exposure and injuries sustained during the severe storm. The case remains open, but active searching was called off after a week. Their families held memorial services with empty caskets. I gave my statement to the police multiple times, leaving out the supernatural elements, saying only that we had been separated during the storm, that I had injured my ankle and made it back to the cabin alone, that I had heard voices outside during the night but been too afraid to open the door. They believed me, more or less, or at least they had no reason to suspect foul play on my part. I was just the lucky one who made it out. I returned to teaching, though I requested a transfer to a different school. I couldn't bear to walk the same halls, see the same classrooms where I had worked alongside my friends. The school administration was understanding. Trauma, they said, manifests in many ways. I live in Arizona now, as far from the mountains of Utah as I could reasonably get while still pursuing my career. I don't hike anymore. I don't camp. I avoid forests when I can, and I never, ever travel alone. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear humming, that same haunting melody that has been burned into my memory. And sometimes in my dreams, I see them, Ryan, Marcus, and Dominic, standing at the edge of the forest, their mouths sewn shut, their eyes empty, waiting patiently for me to join them. Because she's so lonely up there in Lamb's Canyon. So very lonely. And she'll wait forever for company. My name is Michael Williams and I am 34 years old. This happened in the high Uinta's wilderness of northeastern Utah just last summer when what was supposed to be a relaxing solo backpacking trip turned into the most horrifying experience of my life. I'd always been drawn to solitude. Growing up in the suburbs of Salt Lake City meant escaping to the mountains whenever I could. Nature was my therapy. At least it used to be. After my divorce finalized and the pharmaceutical company I worked for downsized my department, I decided I needed more than just a weekend getaway. I needed to disconnect completely, to reset my life. The high Uinta's wilderness seemed perfect. Remote, beautiful, and with enough challenging terrain to keep my mind occupied. I'd planned a 7-day trek through some of the more isolated sections, steering clear of the popular fishing spots and campgrounds. My route would take me past several alpine lakes, through dense forests, and eventually to Kings Peak, Utah's highest point. I'd end at the Henry's Fork trailhead where I'd arranged for a shuttle service to pick me up. "You sure about going alone?" my brother Jake had asked when I told him my plans. Those mountains can be unpredictable." "That's exactly why I'm going," I replied, forcing a smile. "I need unpredictable, just not the office kind." Looking back, I wish I'd listened to him. Day 1 was everything I'd hoped for. The late June weather was perfect. Warm sunshine with a cool breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. I covered 12 miles before setting up camp near a small, unnamed lake, my muscles pleasantly sore from the exertion. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the water, I felt the weight of the past months beginning to lift. That night, I slept better than I had in months, lulled by the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant hooting of an owl. The trouble started on the second day. I woke to find my backpack open, several items strewn across the ground outside my tent. At first, I thought maybe a curious animal had rummaged through my things, but nothing was damaged or chewed, just methodically removed and placed in a semicircle. My compass, map, headlamp, first aid kit, and, strangely, my wedding ring, which I'd kept in a small zippered pocket, were arranged precisely, as if someone had inspected them. "Hello?" I called out, scanning the tree line. "Anyone there?" Only the wind answered, rustling through the pines. I repacked my gear, trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it must have been a particularly clever marmot, or perhaps I'd been careless before bed. The exhaustion from the divorce proceedings had been affecting my memory lately. By midday, I'd reached Naturalist Basin, a stunning alpine valley dotted with lakes and meadows filled with summer wildflowers. I stopped for lunch near Mount Agassiz, taking photos of the spectacular view. When I checked the images later, I noticed something odd. A dark figure standing among the trees at the edge of my frame. It was blurry, possibly just a shadow, but it looked distinctly human-shaped. I zoomed in but couldn't make out any details. Turning to look at the spot where the figure should have been, I saw nothing but trees swaying in the breeze. "Just a trick of the light," I muttered to myself, but took a moment to scan the surrounding area more carefully. I was miles from any popular trail, and I hadn't seen another hiker all day. That afternoon, the weather changed abruptly. Dark clouds rolled in, bringing a biting wind and the distant rumble of thunder. I pushed on, hoping to reach my planned campsite before the storm hit. The trail grew steeper, winding through a boulder field that required careful navigation. As I picked my way through, I noticed odd markings scratched into some of the rocks. Symbols I didn't recognize, geometric patterns, and what looked like primitive stick figures. I just reached the other side of the boulder field when the first fat raindrops began to fall. I quickened my pace, the hair on the back of my neck rising as thunder crashed overhead. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, blinding flashes, and in one of those flashes, I swear I saw someone standing on the ridge above me, watching. When the next flash came, they were gone. By the time I reached my destination, a protected spot near a stand of stunted pines below Tree Lake, I was soaked through and shivering. The rain had turned to hail, pebble-sized chunks of ice pinging off my rain jacket and the ground around me. I hurriedly set up my tent, struggling with the poles as the wind threatened to tear the fabric from my hands. Once inside, I changed into dry clothes and heated water for tea on my small stove, listening to the storm rage outside. As darkness fell, the storm gradually moved off, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. Too tired to cook a proper meal, I ate an energy bar and prepared to sleep. That's when I heard it, a voice carried on the wind, too distant to make out words but distinctly human. I strained to listen, wondering if another camper had been caught in the storm. The voice came again, closer this time, and with a jolt I realized it was calling my name. "Michael!" I froze, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Nobody knew exactly where I was. I'd filed a general trip plan with the ranger station, but I'd intentionally kept my specific route flexible. "Michael, come out." The voice was strange, somehow both childlike and ancient, with an accent I couldn't place. I reached for my headlamp and knife, suddenly very aware of how isolated I was. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "I hear you out there." Silence followed, broken only by the dripping of water from the trees. I unzipped my tent just enough to peer out. The clouds had parted, revealing a bright moon that cast silver light across the landscape. The ground around my tent glistened with melting hail, but there were no footprints, no sign of anyone approaching. Until I looked toward the lake. A figure stood at the water's edge, back turned to me, unnaturally still. Even in the moonlight, it seemed somehow darker than the surrounding night, as if absorbing the light around it. It was roughly human-shaped, but too tall, too thin to be normal. I ducked back inside my tent, heart hammering. After a few moments of indecision, I looked out again. The figure was gone. But on the spot where it had stood, something gleamed in the moonlight. Curiosity overrode my fear, and I stepped out of the tent, knife gripped tightly in my hand. Approaching cautiously, I saw what had caught the light. My wedding ring, which I distinctly remembered packing away that morning after finding it outside my tent. I snatched it up and hurried back to my tent, zipping myself in and lying awake for hours, listening to every sound outside. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a fitful sleep. I dreamt of dark woods and running, always running with something terrible just behind me, calling my name in that strange, ageless voice. The third day dawned clear and bright, mocking my fears from the night before. In the light of day, I managed to convince myself I'd been suffering from altitude sickness, or perhaps just the emotional strain of recent months. I packed up quickly, eager to leave Tree Lake behind. My planned route would take me deeper into the wilderness, toward Henry's Fork Basin. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Twice I spun around, certain I'd catch someone following me, but the trail behind remained empty. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Around midday, I paused at a stream to refill my water bottles. As I knelt by the water, movement caught my eye, something dark drifting downstream. I reached out and caught it before it could float away. A small leather pouch, intricately decorated with beads and what looked like animal teeth. The craftsmanship was unlike anything I'd seen before, neither modern nor matching any Native American styles I was familiar with. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a small bundle of dried herbs, a lock of dark hair tied with sinew, and a yellowed human tooth. The sight of the tooth made me drop the pouch as if it had burned me. It landed on a rock, spilling its contents. "Don't touch what isn't yours," came a voice from behind me. I whirled around to find an old man standing there. He wore modern hiking clothes, faded green pants, and a weathered flannel shirt, but something about him seemed out of place. Perhaps it was his eyes, which were milky with cataracts yet somehow fixed precisely on me, or the way he stood so perfectly still. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I found this floating in the stream. I didn't mean to intrude." The old man smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect for his weathered face. "No matter now. You've opened it. It knows your scent." "What knows my scent?" I asked, backing away slightly. "The Whisperer," he replied simply, as if that explained everything. "It roams these mountains, has for centuries. The Ute feared it. The trappers feared it. Now it's taken an interest in you, Michael Williams." A chill ran through me. "How do you know my name?" The old man chuckled, a dry sound like dead leaves rustling. "I heard it calling for you last night. It only learns the names of those it wants." He stooped to gather the spilled contents of the pouch, movements too fluid for someone of his apparent age. "This was meant to ward it off. Won't work now." "Ward what off? Who are you?" My voice had risen, echoing slightly against the surrounding rocks. "Name's Elijah Blackwood. Been roaming these mountains longer than you've been alive." He straightened up, the pouch now securely in his gnarled hands. "Used to be a ranger, until I saw what lives in the high places." "Look, I don't understand what you're talking about," I said, gathering my gear. "I'm just out for a hike." Elijah shook his head slowly. Not anymore, you're not. Now you're being hunted. It takes different shapes, you know. Sometimes a shadow, sometimes a beast. Sometimes—" He paused, fixing me with those cloudy yet penetrating eyes. "Sometimes it wears faces you trust." "That's enough," I said firmly, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "Thank you for the warning, but I need to get moving if I want to reach my next campsite before dark." "Won't make it to Henry's Fork," Elijah said. "Storm's coming. Bigger than yesterday's. You'd best follow me to my cabin. It's not far." I hesitated. The sky was clear, with no indication of approaching bad weather, and following a strange old man to a remote cabin went against every safety rule of backcountry hiking. "I'll take my chances with the weather," I said politely but firmly. "Thanks, anyway." Elijah shrugged. "Suit yourself. But when night falls and you hear it whispering, remember my offer." He turned and began walking upstream, moving with surprising speed. Within moments, he had disappeared around a bend. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process the bizarre encounter. Part of me wondered if Elijah was real, or if I'd imagined the entire conversation. The isolation and stress of recent months could be affecting me more than I realized. Shaking my head, I continued on my planned route, but Elijah's prediction about the weather proved correct. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds were building over the peaks, and the wind had picked up considerably. I pushed on, hoping to reach a sheltered area I'd marked on my map before the storm hit. I didn't make it. The storm descended with stunning ferocity. Driving rain that quickly turned to sleet, violent gusts that nearly knocked me off my feet, and lightning that struck so close I could smell the scorched earth. With visibility reduced to mere feet, I was forced to make camp in a less-than-ideal spot, a small depression beneath an overhanging rock that offered minimal protection. As I huddled there, wet and miserable, watching darkness fall much too quickly, I couldn't help but remember Elijah's warning about the night and the whispering. I told myself he was just a local trying to scare a tourist, or possibly a hermit whose isolation had affected his mind. The storm raged for hours. Water began seeping into my makeshift shelter, and soon I was sitting in a puddle, shivering despite my rain gear. Just when I thought conditions couldn't get worse, I heard it again. My name, carried on the howling wind. "Michael. Come to me, Michael." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, somehow audible even over the storm. I pulled my knees to my chest, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. "I'm wearing her face now, Michael. Don't you want to see?" My blood turned to ice. Her face. It couldn't mean. A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, and in that instant, I saw a figure standing just beyond my shelter. A woman's silhouette, her hair whipping wildly in the wind. In the darkness that followed, I fumbled for my headlamp with trembling hands, finally switching it on and pointing it toward where the figure had stood. Nothing was there. But as I swept the beam around, I caught a glimpse of movement further away, heading up a nearby slope. Without thinking, I called out, "Kate?" The name of my ex-wife felt strange on my lips after months of avoiding even thinking about her. There was no response, just the relentless howling of the wind. But something compelled me to leave my shelter, to follow. Later, I would recognize this as the moment everything went truly wrong, when some external will began to override my own survival instinct. Rain lashed at my face as I stumbled after the retreating figure, my headlamp cutting a feeble swath through the darkness. I kept catching glimpses, a flash of familiar blonde hair, the red jacket Kate had always worn on our own hiking trips, just enough to keep me moving forward, away from my gear, away from safety. "Kate, wait," I called, though some part of me knew this couldn't possibly be her. She was in Colorado with her new boyfriend, not wandering the Uintas during a storm. The figure led me to a narrow ravine, where the sound of rushing water indicated a stream swollen by the rainfall. Here, the walls of rock provided some shelter from the wind, and the roar of water drowned out the storm's fury. My headlamp flickered, the batteries failing at the worst possible moment. I slapped it against my palm, and the beam stabilized momentarily, landing on a still figure standing on a rock midstream. It was Kate, her face at least. But the expression was all wrong. Kate had always had expressive eyes, quick to laugh or flash with anger. The eyes that stared back at me now were empty, dead things, like glass marbles pressed into a wax figure. The mouth stretched into a grin too wide for a human face. "Found you," the thing wearing Kate's face said in that strange, multi-layered voice I'd heard on the wind. It tilted its head at an impossible angle, nearly touching its own shoulder. "Do you like this shape, Michael? I picked it from your dreams." I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing on the slick rocks. "You're not real," I gasped. The thing laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "More real than you know. I've been waiting for someone like you, someone broken, someone alone." It took a step toward me, moving with a fluidity that no human could match. The sad ones taste better. My headlamp chose that moment to die completely, plunging me into darkness broken only by occasional flashes of lightning. In one such flash, I saw the thing had left the rock and was now standing too close, its face inches from mine, Kate's features melting and reforming into something ancient and terrible. Blind panic took over. I turned and ran, scrambling up the ravine's edge, slipping and cutting my hands on sharp rocks. Behind me, I heard that awful laugh again, followed by splashing sounds as it pursued. I ran without direction, driven by pure animal fear, my only thought to put distance between myself and the horror behind me. I don't know how long I ran, or how far. Eventually, I collapsed from exhaustion, my lungs burning, legs shaking too badly to support me. The rain had lessened somewhat, but the darkness was complete. I had no light, no sense of direction, and worst of all, no idea where my gear was. In my panic, I'd left everything behind: tent, sleeping bag, food, even my map and compass. As I lay there, gasping for breath, trying to calm my racing heart, I became aware of a light in the distance, weak and yellow, like a candle or oil lamp. For a terrifying moment, I thought it might be another trick, the thing luring me in again, but I was out of options. Dawn was hours away, the temperature was dropping, and in my wet clothes, hypothermia was a real danger. Moving cautiously toward the light, I soon made out the silhouette of a small cabin, smoke rising from its chimney. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by suspicion. Who would have a cabin this deep in the wilderness? The answer came as I approached the door, which opened before I could knock. "Told you wouldn't make it to Henry's Fork," said Elijah Blackwood, holding up an oil lantern. "Come in before it finds you again." Too exhausted and frightened to question the old man's sudden appearance, I stumbled inside. The cabin was small but tidy, consisting of one main room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and jars of unidentifiable contents, and a narrow bed in the corner. The warmth from the fire hit me like a physical force, and I gravitated toward it. "Strip off those wet things," Elijah commanded, setting down the lantern and rummaging through a trunk. He produced a set of worn but clean clothes. "These should fit well enough." I changed quickly, my fingers clumsy with cold. The borrowed clothes were old-fashioned and slightly too large but blessedly dry. Elijah busied himself at the fireplace, hanging my wet garments on a line strung nearby, then ladling some kind of stew from a pot into a wooden bowl. "Eat," he said, handing me the bowl and a spoon. "Then we'll talk about what's hunting you." The stew was surprisingly good. Venison with wild onions and roots I didn't recognize. As warmth and strength returned to my body, so did my capacity for rational thought. I looked around the cabin more carefully, noting details I'd missed in my initial relief. There were no electric lights, no modern appliances. The books on the shelves had spines so worn their titles were illegible, and scattered throughout the cabin were protective symbols, some carved into the wooden beams, others painted above doorways and windows. "How did you find me?" I asked finally, setting down the empty bowl. Elijah had settled into a chair across from me, his cloudy eyes reflecting the firelight. "Didn't find you. Knew where you'd be. The Whisperer is predictable in its methods. Always drives them toward my cabin in the end." "Them? You mean there have been others?" The old man nodded slowly. "Many over the years. Hikers, campers, hunters, lost souls, all of them, carrying grief or guilt or rage, emotions the Whisperer can taste, can use." "What is this? Whisperer?" I asked, still not entirely believing but unable to deny my experience in the ravine. "Old as these mountains," Elijah replied, gesturing vaguely toward the walls. The Ute called it Sinav, the trickster. White trappers had other names: Wendigo, Skinwalker, though it's neither, really. Something different, something worse. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It feeds on pain, Michael. Draws out your deepest hurts, wears the faces of those who wounded you, uses your own memories against you." "That's impossible," I said, but without conviction. "You saw it wearing your ex-wife's face," he said simply. It wasn't a question. I swallowed hard. "How could you know that?" "Told you, it's predictable. Takes the shape that will hurt most. That will make you follow, despite your better judgment." He stood up and moved to one of the shelves, selecting a jar filled with dark powder. "Question is, what do you intend to do now?" "Do? I need to get out of these mountains as soon as possible. I need to contact the rangers, warn other hikers." Elijah laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Rangers know. Been filing reports for decades. They mark them wildlife encounters or exposure or just missing. Easier that way." He sprinkled some of the powder along the windowsill. "As for leaving, that's not possible yet." "What do you mean, not possible? Once the storm passes—" "Storm's already passing," Elijah interrupted. "But you've been marked. It won't stop hunting you now, not until it feeds or you defeat it." "Defeat it? How am I supposed to defeat something that can change its shape, that knows my thoughts?" Elijah returned to his chair, fixing me with those unnerving eyes. "There are ways. Old ways. Dangerous, but effective." He gestured to the walls of the cabin. "Why do you think it never comes in here? I've learned its weaknesses over the years." I wanted to dismiss the old man's words as the ramblings of a madman, but after what I'd seen in the ravine, I couldn't. "Tell me," I said finally. Elijah spent the next hour explaining what we would need to do. According to him, the Whisperer was strongest at night and during storms, when the natural world was in chaos. It could take many forms, but was limited by certain rules. It couldn't enter a dwelling without invitation, couldn't cross running water without assuming a physical form, and was repelled by certain herbs and symbols. Most importantly, it could be trapped and bound, forced into a single form and then destroyed, but only if we could lure it to a specific place under specific conditions. "There's a cave," Elijah explained, spreading out a hand-drawn map on the table, "about 2 miles north of here. The Ute used it for rituals, left markings that keep the Whisper at bay. If we can get there before sunset tomorrow, prepare the site correctly, we can end this." "And if we can't?" The old man's expression darkened. "Then it will keep coming for you, following you out of these mountains, haunting you wherever you go, wearing the faces of everyone you care about until it drives you mad enough to—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I thought of the pouch I'd found in the stream, with its human tooth and lock of hair. Trophies, perhaps, from previous victims. "Why are you helping me?" I asked suddenly. "You don't know me." Elijah was silent for a long moment, stirring the fire with an iron poker. "Had a brother once," he said finally. "Jacob. We came to these mountains together in '79. Hunting trip. Something found him. Wore my face to lure him away from camp one night. By the time I realized he was gone, he shook his head. Found him 3 days later. What was left of him? The old man's grief felt palpable in the small cabin. I'm sorry, I said inadequately. Been trying to destroy the thing ever since, he continued as if I hadn't spoken. Come close a few times, but I'm old now, can't move like I used to. Need help. He looked up at me. Need someone it wants, someone it will follow without question. Bait, I said flatly. You need me as bait. Elijah nodded, unapologetic. Yes, but also as help. Can't do the ritual alone anymore. I should have been angry at being manipulated, but instead I felt a strange calm settle over me. If this thing, this whisperer, was real, and after what I'd seen I couldn't deny the possibility, then it would keep hunting me regardless. At least with Elijah, I had a chance. What do we need to do? I asked. The plan was relatively straightforward, though the execution would be anything but easy. At first light, we would gather specific materials, certain herbs that grew nearby, minerals from a particular stream bed, and chalk made from burned bones for drawing protective symbols. Then we would make our way to the cave, prepare the site according to Elijah's knowledge, and wait for sunset, when the Whisperer would be transitioning from its weaker daylight state to its more powerful night form. Most vulnerable during the transition, Elijah explained. That's when we can bind it, force it to take a single shape that can be destroyed. And how exactly do we destroy it? I asked. Elijah reached under his bed and pulled out an old wooden box. Opening it reverently, he revealed an ancient-looking knife with a blade that seemed to absorb the light around it. Ute medicine man gave this to my grandfather, he said. Blades meteoric iron mixed with silver and other things. Only weapon I've found that can harm it. He closed the box carefully. But first, we have to bind it, and that's the dangerous part. We spent what remained of the night preparing as best we could. Elijah taught me phrases in a language I didn't recognize, symbols to draw for protection, the proper handling of the herbs we would gather. I memorized it all with the desperate intensity of a man whose life depended on it. Because it did. At dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline sky and air so clean it almost hurt to breathe. We set out immediately, Elijah moving with surprising agility for his age, me following with a mixture of determination and dread. The day passed in a blur of activity, gathering blackroot from a sunny slope, collecting red ochre from a particular cliff face, harvesting selenite crystals from a dried stream bed. Throughout it all, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of eyes following our every move from the shadows of the forest. Twice, Elijah stopped abruptly, head cocked as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Each time he would change our route slightly, muttering about the Whisperer trying to herd us away from our destination. By mid-afternoon, we had reached the cave, a narrow opening in a limestone cliff that widened into a larger chamber inside. Ancient pictographs covered the walls, faded but still visible in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated from small fissures in the ceiling. Ute shamans used this place for vision quests, Elijah explained as we set down our gathered materials. Powerful ground. The Whisperer can enter, but its powers are diminished here. We worked quickly, preparing the site according to Elijah's instructions. I crushed herbs while he mixed them with other ingredients in a small stone bowl. Together, we drew concentric circles on the cave floor using the bone chalk, inscribing symbols between each ring. Selenite crystals were placed at cardinal points, and the red ochre used to draw more symbols on the cave walls. As the light outside began to fade, Elijah positioned me in the center of the circles. "Remember what I taught you," he said, pressing the wooden box containing the knife into my hands. "No matter what it shows you, no matter what it says, don't break the circles. Don't leave until it manifests fully within the outer ring." "What about you?" I asked, suddenly nervous about being the central figure in this ritual. "I'll be right here," he assured me, stepping into position between two of the circles. "It wants you more than me. Your pain is fresher, your grief more potent, but I'll guide the ritual, help contain it when it appears." The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the cave into near darkness except for the small fire Elijah had built near the entrance. As if on cue, the air grew noticeably colder. My breath frosted in front of my face despite the summer evening. "It's coming," Elijah whispered. "Be ready." The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Among them, I began to detect movement that didn't match the flames, shapes flowing and merging, growing more distinct by the moment. The hair on my arms stood on end as a familiar whisper echoed through the chamber. "Michael, why are you hiding, Michael?" I clutched the wooden box tightly, my knuckles white with tension. Elijah began to chant in that strange language he'd taught me phrases from, his voice resonating oddly in the cave. The shadows coalesced, forming a humanoid figure that paced around the outer edge of our circles. It had no definite shape yet, shifting and flowing like smoke, but its movements were deliberate, predatory. "The old man will fail you," it said, its voice now sounding eerily like Elijah's, "just as he failed the others he brought here." I glanced at Elijah, whose chanting never faltered. He gave a slight shake of his head. "Don't listen. Don't engage." The shadow continued circling, probing for weakness. "He's using you, Michael. Sacrificing you to save himself. How many before you has he led here? Ask him about the others. Ask him what really happened to his brother." I tightened my grip on the box, focusing on Elijah's chanting, trying to block out the insidious whispers. The shadow drew closer to the outermost circle, its form becoming more solid, more recognizable. "Poor Michael," it crooned in Kate's voice. "Always so trusting. That's why she left you, you know. You never saw what was right in front of you." The shape was definitely Kate now, her blonde hair, her slender figure, but with those same dead eyes I'd seen in the storm. She reached toward me, stopping just short of the outermost circle. "She never loved you," the thing wearing Kate's form said. "But I can. I can take away your pain forever." Elijah's chanting grew louder, more insistent. He scattered some of the crushed herbs between the circles, creating a pungent smoke that made the creature hiss and recoil slightly. "Now, Michael," Elijah called. "The binding words." I opened my mouth to recite the phrases he'd taught me, but in that moment, the creature changed tactics. Kate's form dissolved, reforming into a perfect duplicate of Elijah himself. "He's the monster," it said with Elijah's voice gesturing toward the real Elijah. "Look at his eyes. Have you ever seen a human with eyes like that? He's been hunting in these mountains for centuries." The real Elijah never broke his chanting, but I saw fear flash across his face. The creature was trying to confuse me, to make me doubt which was the real Elijah. "The knife," the doppelganger urged. "Use it on him before he completes the ritual. He's binding you, not it." My hand trembled on the box. The two Elijahs were identical. Same weathered face, same clothing, same cloudy eyes. But one stood within the circles as we had planned, while the other urged me to break the pattern. I made my decision. Opening the box, I withdrew the strange knife and began reciting the binding words Elijah had taught me, my voice joining his in the ancient chant. The doppelganger's face contorted with rage. "Fool!" it snarled, its voice no longer Elijah's but that same terrible multi-layered sound I'd heard in the storm. It lunged toward me but stopped at the edge of the outermost circle as if hitting an invisible wall. The real Elijah intensified his chanting, flinging the last of the crushed herbs toward the creature. Where the herbs touched, its form seemed to solidify, becoming less able to shift and change. It writhed, its shape fluctuating wildly between Kate, Elijah, and other forms I didn't recognize. A tall, emaciated figure with two long limbs, a beast-like shape with antlers and glowing eyes, a thing of shadows with too many mouths. "Now!" Elijah shouted between phrases. "It's binding to a form. Strike!" The creature made one last desperate attempt, settling into the form of my brother Jake. "Michael, don't," it pleaded with Jake's voice, Jake's expressions. "It's me. They've got me trapped. Please, little brother." For a heartbeat, I hesitated. It looked so much like him, sounded so much like him. Then I remembered Jake had called me earlier that week, wishing me a good trip. He was safe at home in Salt Lake City. With a cry that was part rage, part fear, I lunged forward, driving the strange blade into the creature's chest. It felt like cutting through dense fog at first, then meeting sudden resistance as the knife found something solid within the shifting form. The creature let out an inhuman scream, a sound so piercing I thought my eardrums would burst. Its form convulsed, shifting rapidly between shapes before settling on something ancient and terrible. A gaunt, pale figure with elongated limbs, a face that was almost human but stretched wrong, with two sharp teeth and a mouth that split its head nearly in half. Black ichor poured from the wound, smoking where it touched the ground. The creature thrashed, its movements becoming more frantic, then more sluggish as the strange blade did its work. Elijah never stopped chanting, even as he reached into the circles to grasp my shoulder, steadying me, guiding my hand to twist the knife deeper. With a final, rattling hiss, the creature collapsed, its body folding in on itself like paper burning without flame, until nothing remained but a dark stain on the cave floor and the knife, which now glowed with an eerie blue light. "It's done," Elijah breathed, finally stopping his chant. He looked older suddenly, the lines in his face deeper, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "After all these years..." I staggered backward, my legs suddenly unable to support me. The adrenaline that had carried me through drained away, leaving me shaking uncontrollably. The knife fell from my nerveless fingers, clattering on the stone floor. Is it really dead?" I managed to ask through chattering teeth. Elijah stooped to pick up the knife, examining the blade carefully before returning it to its wooden box. Yes, that form was its true essence. The blade consumed it. He looked at me with something like respect in his cloudy eyes. "You did well. Most would have broken when it took your brother's shape." "I almost did," I admitted. "If Jake hadn't called me before my trip..." "That's how it works," Elijah nodded. "Uses what it finds in your mind, but it can only access recent memories, strong emotions. It can make mistakes." He began methodically cleaning up the ritual materials. "Best we leave before full dark. Cave is protected, but night still brings other dangers in these mountains." As we made our way back to Elijah's cabin under a sky blazing with stars, I found myself struggling to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to rationalize it all away, a stress-induced hallucination, perhaps, or an elaborate hoax by a lonely old man. But the weight of the experience was too real, the memory of that final inhuman form too vivid. "What will you do now?" I asked as Elijah's cabin came into view. "After all these years hunting it..." The old man was silent for a long moment. "Don't rightly know," he admitted finally. "Been my purpose for so long, I never thought past destroying it." He glanced at me. "Might be time to leave these mountains, see what's become of the world." We spent that night at his cabin, both too exhausted for much conversation. I slept deeply for the first time in days, undisturbed by dreams or whispers. In the morning, Elijah helped me gather emergency supplies, a basic pack, map, compass, and food, enough to reach the nearest ranger station. The storm had pushed me far off my planned route, but Elijah marked a clear path on the map. "What will you tell people?" he asked as I prepared to leave. "About what happened?" I hadn't considered that. Who would believe the truth? "I got lost in the storm," I said finally. "That's all?" Elijah nodded approvingly. "Wise choice. Some truths aren't meant for everyone." He handed me a small leather pouch, similar to the one I'd found in the stream but newer. Take this. Ward against other things that roam these mountains. Might not be the only one of its kind. I accepted the pouch, tucking it securely in an inner pocket. Will I see you again? The old man smiled faintly. Perhaps. World's smaller than it used to be. He extended his hand, and I shook it, noting the surprising strength in his grip. Safe travels, Michael Williams. The journey back to civilization was mercifully uneventful. It took me 2 days to reach Leedy Peak Trailhead, where I found a ranger station and reported myself as a hiker who'd been separated from his gear in a storm. The rangers were professional and unsurprised. Apparently, it happened often enough in the high Uintas. I called Jake from the station, telling him only that I'd had some trouble but was safe. His relief was palpable, and I promised to visit him upon my return to Salt Lake City. I made no mention of seeing his face on the creature in the cave. In the months since that trip, I've tried to resume my normal life. I found a new job, started therapy to process the divorce properly, even began dating again. But the experience in the mountains left its mark on me. I sleep with a light on now. I flinch at whispers carried on the wind. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of something else looking back. Just for a moment, a flicker too quick to be certain. 3 weeks ago, I received a postcard. No return address, no signature, just a picture of Monument Valley on the front and a brief message on the back. Found more of them. Different kinds. Heading east to investigate. Stay vigilant. The handwriting was shaky but recognizable. I've kept the postcard on my refrigerator, a reminder that some threats are real and some protectors are still out there, but I won't be returning to the high Uintas. Some places, once they've shown you their true nature. My name is Rebecca Hill, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of the Ashley National Forest in Utah, near the Uinta Mountains. I still wake up some nights, heart pounding, convinced I can hear that sound again. That low, guttural breathing that didn't belong to anything human. I've always been an avid hiker. Growing up in Salt Lake City, the mountains were my second home. After a particularly rough year, a broken engagement, and my mother's cancer diagnosis, I needed to get away, clear my head, find some perspective in the vast wilderness that had always brought me comfort. My friend Alicia Torres suggested we take a week-long backpacking trip along the Highline Trail. She'd been there once before and spoke of its breathtaking beauty, alpine meadows, crystal lakes, and imposing peaks that made you feel wonderfully insignificant. Alicia was the adventurous type, always pushing boundaries, while I was more cautious and methodical. We balanced each other well. "It'll be good for you, Beck," she insisted, her dark eyes alive with excitement. "Just us, the mountains, and absolutely no cell service." That last part should have been my first warning, but I agreed, desperate for any distraction from my life's current trajectory. We set out on a clear morning in late August. The trailhead at Hayden Pass was already busy with day hikers and weekend warriors, but we knew that would change as we ventured deeper into the backcountry. Our backpacks were heavy with supplies, enough food for 8 days though we'd planned for 6, extra layers for the cold nights, first aid supplies, water filters, and our tents. Ready to leave civilization behind? Alicia grinned as we signed the trail register. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. Lead the way. The first day was everything hiking should be. The weather was perfect. Warm sunshine with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. We passed other hikers occasionally, exchanging friendly nods and trail conditions. By late afternoon, we'd reached our first campsite at Clegg Lake, a pristine alpine lake nestled in a small basin surrounded by weathered peaks. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the water, we set up camp and prepared a simple dinner of dehydrated pasta. The temperature dropped quickly as darkness fell, and we huddled closer to our small campfire. "Have you ever heard of the Uinta Basin Skinwalker?" Alicia asked suddenly, her face eerily illuminated by the dancing flames. I rolled my eyes. "Are you seriously trying to scare me with ghost stories on our first night?" Alicia shrugged. "It's not just a ghost story. The Ute tribe has legends about this area. They say there are creatures that can take human form. They mimic voices, lure people away from safety." "Very funny," I said, but the night suddenly felt colder. "I'm just saying," she continued, "the locals avoid certain parts of these mountains, and they say if you hear someone calling your name at night—" "Stop," I interrupted. "I'd like to actually sleep tonight, thank you very much." Alicia laughed, but there was something hollow about it. "Fine, fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." That night, I slept fitfully. The unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness kept startling me awake. The rustle of wind through trees, the occasional cry of a night bird, the creak and groan of branches. And once, just as I was drifting back to sleep, I could have sworn I heard someone whisper my name from just outside my tent. "Rebecca!" I bolted upright, heart pounding. "Alicia," I called softly. No response. I unzipped my tent just enough to peer outside. The moonlight bathed our campsite in an ethereal blue glow. Alicia's tent was still zipped shut. Nothing moved except the gentle sway of tree branches in the night breeze. I told myself it was just the wind, or a half-dream as I drifted off to sleep. I zipped my tent closed and nestled deeper into my sleeping bag, eventually falling into a troubled sleep. The next morning dawned bright and clear, and the lingering unease from the night before dissipated with the morning mist. We packed up camp and continued along the Highline Trail, climbing steadily higher into the mountains. The terrain grew more challenging, steep switchbacks giving way to rocky traverses across exposed ridgelines. "There's a place about 4 miles ahead called Dead Man's Pass," Alicia said, consulting our map during a water break. "Legend has it a hiker died there back in the 70s, got caught in a sudden storm and froze to death." "You really know how to boost morale," I muttered, adjusting my pack straps. Alicia grinned. "I thought you didn't believe in ghost stories." "I don't," I snapped more harshly than I'd intended. "Let's keep moving." As we approached Dead Man's Pass, a narrow corridor between two imposing rock faces, the weather began to change. Dark clouds rolled in with alarming speed, and the temperature plummeted. What had been a pleasant hiking day suddenly turned threatening. "We should find shelter," I said, eyeing the blackening sky. "That doesn't look good." Alicia nodded, her earlier bravado replaced by genuine concern. "There's supposed to be an old Forest Service cabin about half a mile past the pass. We could try for that." We quickened our pace, but the storm moved faster. By the time we reached the pass, fat raindrops were pelting us and thunder rumbled in the distance. The narrow trail had turned slick and treacherous. "Careful," I called to Alicia, who was a few steps ahead of me. "The rocks are—" My warning was cut short by a terrifying crack of lightning, followed immediately by deafening thunder. The storm was directly overhead now, and the rain had become a deluge. "Run!" Alicia shouted, her voice barely audible over the storm. We pushed forward, slipping and sliding on the muddy trail. Through the curtain of rain, I could just make out a dark shape ahead. The cabin. I hoped. We stumbled toward it, relief flooding through me as the outline of a small wooden structure emerged from the gloom. The cabin was old and weathered, its windows boarded up, but the door hung partially open. We didn't hesitate, pushing inside and slamming the door shut against the howling wind. Inside, it was dark and musty, the air heavy with the smell of rotting wood and something else, something sharp and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. As my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I could make out a single room with a stone fireplace, a rickety table with 2 chairs, and what looked like an old cot in the corner. "Home, sweet home," Alicia said, attempting humor, but her voice sounded strained. I shrugged off my soaking backpack and began to rummage for my headlamp. "At least it's dry. Let's see if we can get a fire going." The fireplace looked like it hadn't been used in years. Cobwebs filled the chimney, and the hearth was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris. But we managed to clear it enough to start a small fire with the emergency kindling we carried. The flames cast long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls. As I hung our wet clothes near the fire to dry, I noticed something odd, markings carved into the wooden walls. At first, I thought they might be trail markers or notes left by previous hikers, but as I looked closer, I realized they were symbols I didn't recognize. Strange angular shapes and spirals that seemed to cover every available surface. "Alicia," I said slowly, "have you noticed these carvings?" She was busy laying out her sleeping bag on the dusty floor, but looked up at my question. "Yeah, weird, right? Probably just bored hikers killing time." But something about the symbols made my skin crawl. They seemed deliberate, almost like a language, or a warning. Outside, the storm raged on, rain lashing against the small windows, wind howling through the cracks in the walls. Despite the fire, the cabin remained unnaturally cold, as if the heat couldn't quite penetrate the chill that had seeped into the wood over years of abandonment. We ate a quiet dinner of trail mix and beef jerky, neither of us particularly hungry. The events of the day and the strange atmosphere of the cabin had dampened our spirits. As darkness fell completely outside, the only light came from our small fire and the occasional flash of lightning. "I'm going to try to get some sleep," Alicia said finally, crawling into her sleeping bag. "Maybe the storm will pass by morning." I nodded, though I doubted I'd be able to sleep. Every creak and groan of the old cabin set my nerves on edge. "Good night," I said, feeding another small branch into the fire. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of abating. Alicia's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, but I remained wide awake, staring into the dying embers of our fire. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift and move in the flickering light, as if they were trying to tell me something. And then I heard it. A soft scratching at the door. At first, I thought it was just a branch blown against the cabin by the wind, but the scratching continued, steady and deliberate. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The fire had died down to almost nothing now, leaving the cabin in near darkness. Scratch, scratch, scratch. And then a voice, so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Rebecca, let me in." It sounded like Alicia's voice, but Alicia was right there, sleeping soundly just a few feet away from me. "Rebecca, I'm cold. Let me in." My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached for my headlamp with trembling hands and switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate Alicia's sleeping form. She was there. She was definitely there, which meant whatever was outside, whatever was calling my name in her voice, was not her. The scratching became more insistent, the voice more pleading. "Rebecca, please, I'm hurt. Let me in." I backed away from the door, bumping into the table, sending one of the chairs clattering to the floor. Alicia stirred, mumbling something incoherent before sitting up. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. Before I could answer, the voice outside changed. It was no longer a perfect imitation of Alicia. It had become something else entirely, something that made my blood run cold. "Rebecca!" it howled, no longer even attempting to sound human. "Let me in!" The door shuddered as something heavy slammed against it. Alicia was fully awake now, scrambling out of her sleeping bag, her eyes wide with terror. "What the hell is that?" she gasped. "I don't know," I whispered, as if keeping my voice down would somehow make whatever was outside forget we were there. The assault on the door continued, the wood beginning to splinter under the force of the blows. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. An eerie silence fell, broken only by our ragged breathing. "Do you think it's gone?" Alicia whispered after what felt like an eternity. I was about to respond when we heard it. Footsteps on the roof. Slow, deliberate footsteps that creaked and groaned on the old wooden shingles. Something was walking back and forth directly above our heads. We stood frozen in the center of the cabin, clutching each other, our eyes fixed on the ceiling. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment all was quiet again. Then came a new sound, a scraping, slithering noise from the chimney. "The fireplace," I choked out, but it was too late. Something was coming down the chimney, something large forcing its way through the narrow opening. We could hear it dislodging years of debris, sending soot and dust billowing into the room. A long, grotesquely thin arm emerged first, fingers too numerous and too long, each tipped with a curved, yellowed claw. Alicia screamed, the sound tearing through the cabin like a physical force. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door. Whatever was coming down the chimney was worse than whatever might be waiting outside. I yanked the door open, half expecting to be confronted by another horror, but there was nothing there, just the storm, still raging with undiminished fury. We ran, abandoning our gear, abandoning everything except the primal need to escape. The rain blinded us, the mud sucked at our feet, but fear propelled us forward along the dark trail. Behind us, I swore I could hear something giving chase, the rapid, heavy footfalls of something not meant to move on two legs. "Don't look back," I screamed to Alicia as we stumbled through the darkness. "Just run." We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. Eventually, the trail widened, opening into a small clearing where a dilapidated wooden sign indicated we had reached Anderson Pass. We collapsed against a large boulder, gasping for breath, straining to hear over the sound of the rain any indication that we were being pursued. "What was that?" Alicia panted, her face pale in the dim light of my headlamp. I shook my head, unable to form words to describe what we'd seen. "We need to keep moving," I said finally. "We need to find other people." But we were miles from the nearest campground, miles from safety, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. We were soaked to the skin, without shelter, without most of our gear, and somewhere behind us was something. "There's a ranger station," Alicia said suddenly, fumbling in her pocket for the map she'd thankfully kept on her person. "Red Pine Ranger Station. It should be about 3 miles northeast of here." It was our only hope. We set off again. We said, moving as quickly as the treacherous conditions would allow. The trail had become a small stream, the water sometimes reaching our ankles as we slogged forward. The darkness was absolute except for the weak beam of my headlamp, which was beginning to flicker ominously as the batteries drained. We'd been walking for what felt like hours when Alicia suddenly stopped, grabbing my arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I held my breath, listening. At first, I heard nothing over the storm, but then a voice calling from somewhere in the darkness behind us. "Rebecca, Alicia, come back, I can help you." It was a man's voice, deep and reassuring, the kind of voice that inspired trust. But there was something about it, a hollow quality, an echo that wasn't quite right. "Don't answer," I hissed to Alicia. "Don't even turn around." We pressed on, moving faster now despite our exhaustion. The voice continued to call, sometimes sounding closer, sometimes farther away, as if it was moving through the forest alongside us. And then my headlamp gave out, plunging us into complete darkness. Alicia's fingers tightened around mine. "What do we do?" she whispered, panic evident in her voice. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, though I knew there was no service. At least it might provide some light. The screen illuminated with surprising brightness, temporarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, I found myself staring into a pair of eyes just beyond the light's reach, eyes that reflected the light like an animal's, but were set in what appeared to be a human face. I screamed, dropping the phone, and the figure lunged forward. In that brief, terrible moment, I saw it clearly. A tall, emaciated figure with skin that hung loosely from its frame as if it didn't quite fit. Its mouth was too wide, filled with needle-like teeth, and its hands ended in long, curved claws. "Run!" I shrieked, pulling Alicia with me as I bolted blindly into the darkness. We crashed through underbrush, no longer following any trail, driven purely by terror. Branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us, but we kept moving, kept running. Behind us, we could hear it giving chase, crashing through the forest with inhuman speed, and then the ground disappeared beneath my feet. One moment I was running, the next I was falling, tumbling down a steep embankment. I heard Alicia cry out, felt her hand torn from mine, and then came the impact, a jarring collision with hard ground that drove the air from my lungs. I lay there, dazed and winded, unable to move, unable to call out. Rain pelted my face as I stared up at the dark sky, waiting for my senses to return. Gradually, I became aware of a dull pain in my left ankle and a sharper pain in my right shoulder. I tried to sit up, gritting my teeth against the pain. "Alicia!" I called, my voice sounding weak and small in the vastness of the night. "Alicia, where are you?" No response. I fumbled in the mud for my phone, praying it had survived the fall. My fingers closed around it, and miraculously it still worked. I shone its light around me, trying to get my bearings. I had fallen into some sort of ravine or gully. The embankment rose steeply behind me, at least 15 feet of loose soil and exposed roots. There was no way I could climb back up, especially with my injured ankle. Ahead of me, the gully continued downward, presumably following the natural flow of water down the mountain. "Alicia!" I called again, louder this time, desperation making my voice crack. Still nothing. I had no choice. I had to move, had to find help. Using a sturdy branch as a makeshift crutch, I began to make my way down the gully, hoping it would lead to a trail or, better yet, the ranger station we'd been seeking. The going was slow and painful. My ankle throbbed with each step, and the rain made the ground treacherously slippery. But the thought of what might be lurking in the darkness kept me moving forward. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the endless night. The storm gradually began to abate, the rain slowing to a gentle drizzle, then stopping altogether. The clouds parted occasionally, allowing brief glimpses of a moon that was just past full. And then I smelled smoke, wood smoke, the kind that comes from a controlled fire. Hope surged through me, giving me renewed strength. I quickened my pace as much as my injured ankle would allow, following the scent. The gully eventually widened and sloped more gently, merging with the forest floor. Through the trees ahead, I could see the warm glow of lights. The ranger station, it had to be. I emerged from the trees to find not the modern facility I had expected, but a small rustic cabin with light spilling from its windows. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and a battered pickup truck sat parked nearby. It wasn't the ranger station, but it was shelter. It was safety. I limped to the door and knocked, then knocked again more forcefully when there was no immediate response. Finally, the door swung open to reveal an old man, his weathered face creased with surprise at finding a bedraggled hiker on his doorstep in the middle of the night. "My God, girl, what happened to you?" he asked, stepping aside to let me in. "My friend," I gasped, the words tumbling out in a rush. "She's still out there. We were attacked. Something was chasing us. Please, you have to help her." The old man's expression changed, a shadow passing over his features. Come in," he said, ushering me inside. "Let's get you warm, and you can tell me exactly what happened." The cabin was simple but comfortable, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a fire burned steadily. The walls were lined with bookshelves and what looked like hunting trophies, mounted antlers and preserved animal heads. A large wooden table stood in the center of the room, covered in maps and what appeared to be old journals. "Sit," the old man said, pulling out a chair at the table. "I'm Jacob Weaver. Been living in these mountains for nigh on 40 years now." "Rebecca Hill," I replied automatically, sinking gratefully into the chair. "My friend and I were hiking the Highline Trail when the storm hit. We took shelter in an old Forest Service cabin near Dead Man's Pass, but there was something there." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "What kind of something?" I hesitated, suddenly aware of how insane my story would sound. "I don't know. some kind of creature. It imitated our voices, tried to get us to let it in. When it couldn't, it came down the chimney. We ran, but got separated in the forest. I fell into a ravine. My friend Alicia, she's still out there." Jacob was silent for a long moment, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Then he sighed heavily, running a gnarled hand through his thinning white hair. "You encountered what the Ute people call a skinwalker," he said finally, his voice low and serious. "A human who's gained the power to transform into animals by breaking a sacred taboo, usually by killing a family member. They're crafty creatures, dangerous. They can mimic any voice they've heard." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for him to crack a smile and reveal this was just another ghost story meant to scare tourists. But his expression remained grave. "You can't be serious," I said. "Has a heart attack," Jacob replied. "These mountains have secrets, Miss Hill. Things that most people who come up here hiking and camping never encounter. You were unlucky, or maybe the creature was drawn to you for some reason." I shook my head, unwilling to accept what he was saying. "Look, I don't know what we saw tonight, but I know my friend is still out there. We need to call for help, organize a search party." "No phone service up here," Jacob said. "I've got a radio, but in this weather, I doubt we'll reach anyone till morning. And trust me, you don't want to go back out there tonight. That thing will still be hunting." A chill ran down my spine at his words. "Then what do we do? I can't just leave Alicia out there." Jacob stood up, moving to one of the bookshelves. He selected an old leather-bound volume and returned to the table. "First, we protect ourselves. If your friend has survived this long, she's either found shelter or—" He let the sentence hang unfinished. He opened the book, revealing pages covered in handwritten text and drawings, diagrams of symbols that looked disturbingly similar to the carvings I'd seen in the Forest Service cabin. "These will keep it out," Jacob said, pointing to a particular set of symbols. "The Ute taught me. I've got them carved above every door and window in this cabin." I wanted to dismiss it all as superstition, the ramblings of an old hermit who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness. But after what I'd seen tonight, I couldn't. The memory of those reflective eyes, that too wide mouth filled with needle teeth, was too fresh, too real. "If this skinwalker has Alicia," I said, forcing myself to use the term, "what will it do to her?" Jacob's silence was answer enough. We spent the remainder of the night preparing. Jacob showed me how to create protective charms using materials he had on hand: salt, sage, specific arrangements of twigs bound with red thread. He explained that skinwalkers had weaknesses, that they could be injured by silver or weapons blessed with certain herbs and prayers. All the while, I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a gaunt face pressed against the glass, watching us with those terrible reflective eyes. But the night remained quiet. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. As dawn approached, Jacob prepared his old radio, attempting to reach the actual ranger station at Red Pine. The connection was poor, filled with static, but he managed to communicate enough details to initiate a search for Alicia. "I'll take you down to meet them once it's fully light," he said, switching off the radio. "They'll want to hear your account firsthand." I nodded, exhaustion washing over me now that the immediate danger had passed. "Do you think they'll believe me? About what we saw?" Jacob's weathered face creased in a humorless smile. "They won't say they do, but the rangers who've been in these mountains long enough know there are things they can't explain. They'll search for your friend regardless." True to his word, as soon as daylight filled the sky, Jacob helped me into his pickup truck for the bumpy drive down to the ranger station. My ankle had swollen considerably overnight, and each step was agony despite the makeshift brace Jacob had fashioned for me. The Red Pine Ranger Station was a modern facility. Nothing like Jacob's rustic cabin. A team was already assembling in the parking lot as we arrived. Forest Service personnel, local search and rescue volunteers, even a few police officers from the nearest town. I recounted my story again and again, each time omitting the more supernatural elements, focusing instead on the facts: the storm, taking shelter in the cabin, getting separated from Alicia in the darkness, my fall into the ravine. I provided a detailed description of Alicia and the clothes she'd been wearing, the approximate location where I'd last seen her. No one questioned my sanitized version of events, though I caught a few knowing glances between Jacob and one of the older rangers. They organized into search teams and headed out, promising to do everything possible to find Alicia. I wanted to join them, but my injuries made that impossible. Instead, I was taken to the small medical clinic in the nearest town, White Rocks, where a doctor confirmed I had a severe sprain, not a break, and treated the various cuts and bruises I'd accumulated during my ordeal. The search for Alicia continued for 3 days. I stayed in White Rocks calling her family, dealing with the authorities, waiting for news. On the morning of the 4th day, a Forest Service vehicle pulled up outside the small motel where I'd been staying. The ranger who knocked on my door looked exhausted, his face grim. "Miss Hill, we found something." My heart sank. The tone of his voice told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke the words. They had found Alicia's body in a ravine not far from where I had fallen. The official report would list her cause of death as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. They theorized that she had continued running in the darkness after we were separated, unaware of the treacherous terrain, and had fallen just as I had, but with far more tragic results. I nodded numbly as the ranger explained all this, but I knew with a bone-deep certainty, that Alicia hadn't simply fallen. The thing in the forest, the skinwalker Jacob had told me about, had caught her. Whether it had chased her to her death or done something worse, I would never know. The investigation concluded quickly. A tragic hiking accident, the authorities said, a reminder of the dangers of backcountry travel, especially during inclement weather. Alicia's body was transported back to her family in Colorado, and I gave my official statement, again omitting any mention of the creature we'd encountered. Before I left Utah, I visited Jacob one last time. He'd come down to White Rocks when he heard they'd found Alicia, had sat with me during those first terrible hours of grief. "You're heading home?" he asked as we sat on the porch of the small cabin he kept in town for the occasional supply run. I nodded. "There's nothing left for me to do here." "You know it's still out there," he said quietly. "In the mountains. Hunting." A shiver ran through me despite the warm afternoon sun. "I know. And you know that it knows you. It heard your voice, smelled your fear. These creatures, they have long memories." I met his gaze, understanding what he was trying to tell me. "You think it might come for me someday?" Jacob shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. But you should be prepared, just in case. Knowledge is protection." He handed me a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Some things to help you sleep at night, and my phone number, for what it's worth, if you ever need to talk, or if you ever think it's found you." I took the package, feeling the weight of it, both physical and metaphorical. "Thank you." As I drove away from the mountains back toward the world I'd left behind, the broken engagement, my mother's illness, the everyday concerns that had once seemed so overwhelming, I found myself checking the rearview mirror more often than necessary, scanning the tree line that gradually receded behind me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the creature, if it had ever really existed outside my fear-addled imagination, was confined to the remote wilderness of the Uinta Mountains. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when I jolt awake from nightmares filled with two wide grins and reflective eyes, I wonder if it's out there somewhere, watching, waiting, remembering my scent and the sound of my voice. And I wonder, with a dread that never quite leaves me, if someday I'll hear it again, that soft scratching at my door, followed by a voice that sounds just like someone I trust, calling my name, asking to be let in. "My name is Rebecca Hill, and this is my warning to you. Be careful in the wilderness. Not everything that walks on two legs is human, and not every voice that calls your name belongs to a friend. some things are ancient and hungry, wearing faces that almost, but not quite, pass for human. And once they know you, they never forget.